I'm sure there are many things that are keeping Putin up at night right now. But without a doubt, the Siberian separatist movement is definitely his biggest nightmare.
They, starting from Tsarist Russia, when they colonized us, they destroyed our culture, our language, our traditions. They are simply engaged in Russification. We are really tired of this. Understand us. We live poorly. They take everything from us. We are not even pacified. How long can you trust him? Russia, as it was in Tsarist times, as it was under the USSR, remains the same now under Putin. We are really tired of this. I'm tired of this, of depending on it. I want independence for my republic and to decide my own destiny.
This is the Siberian Battalion, and they have joined the war on Ukraine's side in order to fight for freedom against Russia. The hope for them is that once the Kremlin falls into the hands of Ukraine, they will have the opportunity to break free. This is an awkward situation, considering the fact that Siberia is a part of Russia, but it has chosen to fight against its homeland. Having enemies in your own camp is the biggest betrayal. But Putin has brought this upon himself because, for years, he has not addressed the concerns of the Siberian people. Siberians are a special breed of Russians, and the phrase "Russia's wealth will grow through Siberia" is commonly repeated in the region. This is because Siberia feeds the rest of Russia, and gets little in return for it, which has led to its dissatisfaction with Russian leadership. What this situation shows us is that if you're unable to deal with your issues at home, the rest of the world will see your dirty laundry. Now, as talk of secession keeps growing, Putin's bots are going to become more aggressive under our videos. Please help us fight back and like our videos and share them with your friends and family. We really appreciate it. Secession is the act of withdrawing from a larger entity, in which in most cases is a state or an organization. In the past couple of years, these movements have become more constant in Russia. I'm sure by now you've heard of the Chechen rebels or even the Tatarstan separatist movements. What these movements all represent is that Russia will fall pretty soon. Now, there are probably two things that most people know about Siberia. One, it's a cold place to be, and two, it's where all the prisoners and exiles are sent. What people don't talk about is how beautiful the region is and how rich it is in resources. Siberia is basically the large portion of land that covers the north and the eastern part of Russia. On the west, it separates Europe from Asia with the Ural Mountains, and on the east, we have the Pacific Ocean. Before we go any further, one thing that I need to point out is that the rumors are true. The climate of Siberia is subarctic and arctic primarily, so the temperatures in the region definitely drop frequently. From very early on, it's difficult to differentiate Siberia's story from Russia's. By the time the Soviet era came about, Siberia had already been well integrated into the Russian Empire. The role that the Soviet era played was properly setting everything up. During the Russian Empire, Siberia was the agricultural hub, but after that, things turned industrial. Because of the large number of immigrants, land was used very intensely, which led to exhaustion of the land and frequent bad harvests. This forced Russia to look for a new way to make money off of that land. Around this time, the first signs of discontent started to creep in. Siberian regionalism started to grow, and they wanted to become an autonomous region completely independent from Russia. This movement actually made it off the drawing board. A provisional regional government was set up in 1918, and the regionalists and the anti-Bolsheviks pushed back against Russian rule. There was an elected president and a council of ministers, and it seemed that Siberia could be autonomous. Unfortunately, the fairy tale was very short-lived. In that very same year, two battles were fought: the battle in western Siberia and the siege of Omsk, and Siberia lost its independence. On November 18, 1918, the Siberian Republic was overthrown, and the provisional all-Russian government was set up. During this period, a lot of groundwork was done, and the Trans-Siberian Railway connecting the region to European Russia was set up in 1916. The most famous of the railroad projects was the Baikal-Amur main line, which was the railway that connected Siberia to the Russian Far East. The main line is out of this world and passes through 14 major rivers, 21 tunnels, and the mountainous terrain in the region. The construction began just before World War II, but was soon put on hold during the war and restarted then after. On top of the railroad development in the second half of the 20th century, Russia began its exploration of mineral and hydro-energy resources, and many projects were concluded. A lot of hydroelectric power plants were built in the 1960s and 70s on the Angara River, and these power plants powered large production facilities such as the aluminum plant in Bratsk and Ust-Ilimsk, rare earth mining in Angara Basin, and projects within the timber industry. Woven into Siberia's history is a period of time in which many people wish they could pretend never happened. At the end of the war, the region became a dump site for the fallen prisoners collected during the fight. Thousands of captured soldiers were sentenced to several years of work in labor camps in all the regions of Siberia, and most of them did not make it out of the region alive. Although these camps were not really for putting prisoners to death, the death rate was significant, especially during the cold Siberian winters. The range of work done in these labor camps ranged from vegetable farming to the construction of the Baikal-Amur main line. In this clip, a woman retells the terrors of the time.
Vesela ģimene, viņi izmira visi. Viņiem kaut kāds 5 laikam cilvēki bija. Un tad Falka tāds bija, mums likās tāds, viņš gan gāja uz mežu ar mums, bet atkal viņš bija jau pieaudzis. Viņam gadu laikam 16, 17 bija, un tad viņš aizgāja uz Igarku, un tad viņu atveda šitā tā, ka rāpo cilvēks, tās rokas un kājas, zina, tā. Un tad viņu pavisam baltu un beigtu viņš nosalizāt šito te atveda. Tad to es redzēju vienīgo, bet tādu bija daudz.
These camps were known as gulags, and they were notorious for the harassment and brutal treatment of prisoners. This name was actually an acronym for the Russian phrase Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. And Moscow also used to use these camps as prisons for criminals and political radicals. Here are some of the most famous names that you probably did not know went to live in these hellholes. Vladimir Lenin, who was pretty big during the Russian Revolution, spent 3 years exiled in Krasnoyarsk for his activities. And one of Russia's most well-known poets, Osip Mandelstam, was sent to the Gulag twice. In 1924, these labor camps ramped up in cruelty when Stalin took over. He decided to use these camps to purge the country of anyone disloyal to his regime. And millions of Soviet citizens were executed or sent to the Gulag for crimes like speaking out against Stalin. Things were so bad that the lowest estimated figure for the number of people who died was a staggering 20 million. The Gulag prisoners would be packed into train cars on the Trans-Siberian Railroad and then shipped away into the freezing cold. Once they arrived there, they experienced workdays as long as 12 to 14 hours. As you can expect, the prisoners were given meager rations and often slept on bunks made of wooden planks. Now, can you imagine that in the freezing Arctic cold that is Siberia, some prisoners went without blankets? Temperatures would drop to as low as -50 degrees, and most people froze to death. The guards exercised ruthless control over them and sometimes shot inmates who tried to flee. Do we even want to begin to get into the sanitation issues? Things were so bad that most of the prisoners were simply taken out by diseases. If there's no water to drink, there is definitely none to keep the prisoners clean or their living spaces. On other occasions, just for laughs, soldiers killed prisoners for petty offenses just to instill fear in the others. Another psychological punishment that they implemented was the punishment cells. These were confined spaces that they would throw prisoners into to isolate them for days on end. After having starved the life out of these prisoners, they would then publicly execute them. The options for the people unfortunate enough to end up here were very few. It was either you died in the camps or in the vast wilderness of the Siberian mountains. The numbers recorded are really scary, and it's believed that 9 out of every 10 prisoners died in the gulags, including many artists and intellectuals. In 2018, the last political survivor of Stalin's gulags, Vasily Kovalev, died. Before he died, he did an interview with Vezma, where he told the story of his time in Siberia. In 1950, Kovalev was 20 years old when he was found guilty of anti-Soviet sabotage. He had been notorious for unscrewing important spare parts from military vehicles and was caught in his crime. According to Vezma, until his last breath, he never forgot what the Soviet Union did to millions of people who endured the camps, leaving their best years, their health, and their lives there. He told the story of his trip back to Odessa region, where he met the people who had put him in prison, and he did not forgive them. The cruelty and torment of camp life taught him to survive, but at the same time, to stay human. Many people like Kovalev died mentally insane, driven to the edge by everything that they had experienced. Stalin's camps are constantly likened to Hitler's concentration camps, and this period will always be a stain on Siberian history. After Stalin died, Nikita Khrushchev came into power in the Soviet Union and condemned the atrocities committed in the Gulag. Under his leadership, the Gulags continued to flourish, but Now they were not as terrible. Currently, these prisons are tourist attractions where people can experience a piece of Russian/Siberian history. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Siberia saw its chance to break away from Russia, as did most territories. In 1991, the Siberian regionalism made a comeback, and the Siberian Republic movement wanted to create a sovereign state. The movement was called the Tyumen Republic Movement, and it declared independence in 1992. The Russian government quickly responded to this, and in 1993, the separatist movement was silenced. Although they did not manage to get back their independence, the one positive outcome of the dissolution was that Siberia actually got an opportunity to gain regional autonomy. It was divided into different oblasts, including Tomsk and Krasnoyarsk. These regions have the power to legislate themselves and decide a budget for their area. This freedom also comes with partial control of the resources and their distribution. The truth behind the decentralization was that Moscow did not have the capacity to govern all of these regions in the midst of trying to fix things, so it decided to delegate its work. While Siberia got to take over some things, Moscow still abused the region for its resources. The collapse of the industries during that time was also a hard hit for Siberia, because it was the star of the manufacturing and mining industry in Russia. Moscow did nothing to cushion the blow in this capacity, and the high unemployment rates and poverty were a big problem. In the post-Soviet era to date, the cry from Siberia has been about autonomy. We will talk about why later, but right now, we want to pinpoint that the separatist chat never really died down. In the mid-1990s, the agenda was for Siberia to seek greater autonomy from the Federation. This would allow for economic self-management and allow for cultural preservation, which is a big thing for Siberia. The Siberia Autonomous Movement tried things the right way, and in 1997, they put a proposal before the Russian government. The petitioning and letter writing had failed, and they were trying to get the government to hear them out. Although a few changes were made after this, it has not been enough. Around the same time, there was also the Tyumen Regionalist Movement, the Altai's People's Republic Movement, and the Krasnoyarsk Regionalist Movement. All these movements had the same desire, and Russia's ignoring them did not make them disappear. The recent talks about secession are scary for Russia because of how important Siberia is to Russia's framework. Today, Siberia accounts for approximately 75% of the country's land area and 25% of its population. Let's think about it practically. If you take away about 75% of the landmass for a country as big as Russia, what are you leaving the Kremlin with? Siberia has been called Russia's treasure chest, and many Russian writers have praised Siberia as the untamed frontier and a new world savior for the rest of Russia. One of the things that made Russia the formidable giant in the world is how big it is. Think about it. Bullies get away with things that they do because no one has the guts to pick a fight with them at that size. Now imagine what would happen if your local bully knocked off some inches or lost a couple of pounds. Not that scary, right? At the border of China, Mongolia, and Kazakhstan, the big bad Siberia works as Russia's bodyguard. Now, if it were to become its own state, Russia would be vulnerable. Russia has taken advantage of Siberia's location and has set up its military installations in the region, including air bases and naval bases that have submarines for the Pacific Fleet. On top of it all, Siberia is also the base for a large part of Russia's nuclear arsenal. This makes it a ticking time bomb, but it also provides a deterrent zone that the rest would not dare cross. One of the things that drew Russia to Siberia, and the thing that will make it hard for Russia to let it go, is its natural resources. According to Russian calculations, Siberia holds just under 80% of Russia's oil resources, about 85% of its natural gas, 80% of its coal, similar amounts of precious metals and diamonds, and a little over 40% of the nation's timber resources. Furthermore, research by economist Peter Weston has demonstrated that outside of Moscow and the industrial region in Samara and the Urals, the major contributors to the Russian economy in terms of per capita gross regional product, or GRP, are the natural resource regions like Siberia and the Russian Far East. If we're talking about oil, Tyumen in western Siberia tops the list. If we're talking about diamonds, then it's Sakha in Siberia, and mining is held down by Magadan. Now, before we get carried away with Siberia's riches, let us also not forget the groundwork that we discussed earlier, which set up the intricate transport system through Siberia. The Trans-Siberian Railway that was built from 1891 to 1916 is actually the world's longest railway line. It is very famous and passes through 8 different time zones. On top of the Trans-Siberian Railway, you have the Baikal-Amur main line, which was created to complement the TSR. Highways, waterways, seaports, and airports are scattered all over the region and work to keep the connection with the rest of the country. Removing Siberia would be the same as taking a chunk off of a jigsaw puzzle and somehow expecting the rest of the puzzle to just make sense. It also does not make sense for Russia to let go of Siberia now, as it is about to set itself up as a tourist wonderland. Nowadays, tourists are hopping on the Trans-Siberian Railway and taking a scenic trip through Siberia to see it all. Lake Baikal, which is the world's largest and deepest freshwater lake, is popular for hiking and boat tours, and many people also love to hike in the scenic Altai Mountains. The rich history of Siberia is also very important to tourists, who even visit some of the gulags to learn about the Soviet era's dark past. Russia needs to be able to capitalize on this tourist boom because it improves its image and lines its pockets at the same time. Ultimately, the problem is that Russia has just laid too much down in Siberia, and it cannot imagine it separating. Its reliance, economically, strategically, and symbolically, makes this situation a full-blown crisis for Moscow. The talks about secession have not been pulled from thin air, and there have been definite grumbling among the people of Siberia. The biggest fallout that Siberia is having with Moscow is because of economic exploitation. Despite the numerous natural resources that Siberia has blessed the rest of Russia with, the region itself is embarrassingly underdeveloped. The bustling industrial hub of the Soviet era has been reduced to nothing. Geographer Michael Bradshaw has called what is happening the Siberian dilemma. This dilemma is basically what others have referred to as the resource curse and speaks to the fact that Siberia is being bled dry. In order to keep the economic wheels spinning, the country needs energy resources from West and East Siberia. But in order to recover these resources, Russia has to basically drain Siberia of everything that it's got. What the mass industrialization and resource drain has done is leave parts of Siberia both misdeveloped and overdeveloped. What is further fueling the dilemma is that Moscow doesn't care. To properly understand how self-seeking the main Russian government is, let's do a case study of the Yukos Oil Company scandal. Yukos was founded in 1993 and was a very big part of the oil landscape in Siberia. Mikhail Khodorkovsky took over the company and turned it into Russia's largest oil producer. The privatization of such a large oil production hub was part of how former President Yeltsin kept the uber-rich Russians happy. When Putin came along, he was happy to protect the oligarchs' interests as long as they remained subjugated to the regime. The company was such a big part of Siberia's production and produced jobs to thousands of people. Despite getting his wealth from the region, Khodorkovsky was a bad steward of the resources, at least according to Putin. The real reason behind this was the fact that Khodorkovsky tried to challenge Putin's political position. So, in 2003, Khodorkovsky was arrested on charges of tax evasion and embezzlement. The effect of this was that the company had to declare bankruptcy in 2006. The bankruptcy of a small company has a minimal effect, but this decision had such a domino effect on Siberia as a whole. Thousands of employees lost their jobs, and the $50 billion arbitration award that was required for the company's actions definitely destabilized the economy of the region big time. After the scandal, Rosneft, a state-owned oil giant, took over, but corruption and mishandling of funds is still very much rife. The self-serving nature of Moscow has led to a lot of grumbling in Siberia, where people get the short end of the stick after having their resources sucked out of the region. The restrictions that have been imposed on Russia's oil supply because of Putin's foolery did not help the situation at all. This means that economically, Siberia is suffering, and there's nothing that Moscow is doing to fix the situation. A 2020 survey by the Levada Center revealed that 44% of Siberians feel their region has its own distinct culture. 31% believe that Siberia should have greater autonomy, and 21% identify as Siberian rather than Russian. There is very clearly a disconnect between the Siberian identity and Russian identity, and that is a good enough reason for the desire for autonomy. People really underestimate how important belonging is, but these are the types of things that fuel revolutions. From our in-depth discussions of history, we saw that Russia really tried to culturally suppress Siberia and force its indigenous peoples to adopt the Russian language, culture, and religion. This treatment completely ignored the fact that there are very distinct traditions and customs that are part of Siberian heritage. While Russia primarily revolves around Orthodox Christianity, the indigenous traditions of Siberia are far removed from this. The Siberians have a strong shamanism background and believe in rituals and rites like animal sacrifices. So they are deeply connected to nature and believe that spirits inhabit animals and objects. During colonization, Russia tried to shove Christianity down their throats, but folklore and tradition still stays. Siberian culture is still blatantly visible today. It is actually criminal that Russia refuses to acknowledge it. Let us look, for example, at the Yusuk festival. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. The Yakuts mark the summer solstice holiday as a way of honoring their nature deities by celebrating renewal and fertility. The festival is considered a festival for the soul, and families come together and eat traditional dishes and drink fermented mare's milk. The festival is opened with a prayer to the sun in the circular open-air altar, and then people begin to participate in group folk dances in traditional costumes. The festival runs for days on end and includes musical performances, sports competitions, battle reenactments, and all-night feasting before celebrants greet the sunrise of the year's longest days. The problem for Siberia is that they do not feel connected to any other area in European Russia. It also does not help that the location is remote, which creates a further sense of isolation. They had spent a lot of time under their harsh climates and within the rugged landscape, shaping a sort of Siberian resilience and self-reliance. Russia's biggest failure is that they have failed to balance the regional identity with national unity by preserving cultural diversity and promoting inclusivity. Another fatal mistake that has been committed by Moscow is the complete marginalization of Siberia entirely. Because of the nature of Siberia's problems, it cannot be solved in an internal context. If you take a look at the main strategy documents in the country in recent years, you will find that there is nothing that talks about how Russia is going to help Siberia. The strategy for the spatial development of the Russian Federation up to 2025 does not even identify the region of Siberia in any way, meaning that it is not a national priority. A lot of economists call this the Siberian curse. Siberia's resources benefit Moscow greatly, but nothing is ever done for the local population in turn. There is underfunding in infrastructure, healthcare, and education, which makes Siberia feel like the poor cousin. In 2012, the Tomsk region delivered 130 billion rubles of tax revenue to Russia's exchequer, but it got back a mere 10.3 billion, with the remaining 92 billion disappearing into the common pot mysteriously. Adding insult to injury, Siberian political representatives in the national government are very few, and this means that no one is representing their interests at a national level. Siberia also has very limited access to information from the central government, and this makes them feel like outsiders. All of these feelings of discontentment have fueled the separatist movement. Okay, so let us pick up where we left off in relation to the Siberian separatist movement. In the 2000s, the separatist movements were still alive and well. The movement was pretty popular on the internet, and Wikipedia even opened a section in the Siberian language that, by 2007, was the 66th largest in the world. In the 2010s, you had people like Konstantin Irmenko behind a movement calling for the people to declare their nationality as Siberian. These seemingly subtle things should have raised alarm bells for Moscow. Before a national census was held, posts appeared on social media encouraging Siberians to declare their nationality as Siberian rather than Russian, Tatar, or German. In 2012, in the very thick of protests against Moscow, protesters in Novosibirsk were lifting signs writing, "Stop feeding Moscow." This slogan has become so popular in Ural, Siberia, and Yakutia because they are the regions that possess colossal natural resources but receive only a fraction of the amount that they pay in taxes to the federal budget. One of the rally organizers, Novosibirsk nationalist Rostislav Antonov, said at a press conference that Siberia is the main source of wealth for Russia, and yet it does not have enough money for basic necessities. The biggest fight of the early 2010s was the disproportional distribution of resources that saw Moscow taking everything from Siberia but giving them nothing in return. The agenda of the rally was to show that Siberians do not need other people's money and that they could earn enough for themselves. What Siberia was demanding was a change in tax allocation mechanisms so that a regional component would be incorporated into the tax on mineral extraction. To its detriment, Russia decided not to listen again. Novosibirsk struck again and began the March for Siberian Federalization, during which protesters called for autonomy and self-governance. This movement grew so much in popularity that Putin had to sign a law criminalizing calls for separatism. Just 7 months later, he signed legislation increasing potential fines and extending the maximum jail term from 3 to 4 years for such offenses. In 2012, there was the Free Siberia movement that was organized all over social media by separatists. The movement went commercial, and I'm Siberian merchandise was developed in May of 2012. The brand owner stated that they were trying to create a unique Siberian style and to promote Siberia around the world in its most up-to-date form. On the first day of sales, hundreds of t-shirts, sweatshirts, passport covers, and other products were sold under the brand I'm Siberian. From there, the brand was able to open shops and currently has branches in tons of cities. Even film became invested in the fight for Siberia. Taking advantage of the power of social media, a popular blogger and a Novosibirsk artist shot a documentary entitled Oil for Nothing, where they spoke about how the federal center got the lion's share of Russia's budget, financed with the wealth and labor of Siberia.
В Сибири без дорог, ну зимой тем более, все. Это постепенная смерть.
Нужно строить дороги, нужно реально не на пиаровские какие-то мероприятия бабло пилить, а нужно дороги строить. Ну, как говорят у нас там и то, и другое, и пиво. То есть в первую очередь, наверное, в том, что это не стало государственной стратегией. Хотя, если брать опыт других стран, то есть Америку 30-х годов, Японию 50-х годов, Германию тоже 30-х и 50-х годов, то есть видно, что в кризисные периоды нормальное государство, оно как раз строило дороги и давало возможность работы людям. Фактически 1 рубль, вложенный в дорогу, потом дает 3, 5, 10 рублей в зависимости от региона. Ну, мультикассовый эффект, понятно, что.
The film was also heavily focused on how little Moscow invested in Siberia's development, and how the region felt more like a colony. The lack of transportation infrastructure in the region, which stretches over millions of square miles, was the biggest issue, considering how the rest of Russia looks like today. In the spring of 2013, a scandalous exhibition titled The United States of Siberia was held in Novosibirsk. Moscow Center for Contemporary Art Winzavod launched the exhibition of works created by Siberian artists, which included pieces from Omsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Novosibirsk. One of the artists emphasized that Siberia is so far away and detached from elsewhere in the world. After the exhibition, the flag of the United States of Siberia caused a national scandal. A group of Siberian activists created a flag design for the hypothetical state. It became controversial because it was symbolic of the strong separatist sentiments and a sign that regional discontentment was definitely brewing. The t-shirts, the displays, and the flag were really just the beginning. Symbols of the Siberian Republic are increasingly beginning to appear on Novosibirsk streets, and this should be a wake-up call for Moscow. In 2017, at the height of Navalny's run in politics, Siberia stood behind him and led a wave of anti-government protests in the Pacific port city of Vladivostok, rolling west and across half a dozen time zones. The protests were known as the Far From Moscow protests, and thousands of people in Novosibirsk shocked the Kremlin by stepping in. The slogan that was running was, "Corruption is robbing us of our future." And at the protests, demonstrators chanted, "Putin is a thief," and "Power to the millions, not the millionaires." The Siberia Without Putin movement was a strong movement in 2017. Protesters were fighting hard for democratic reform and regional autonomy. In March of 2017, protests began in Novosibirsk, Omsk, and other cities, where the demand was for Putin to resign and for regional autonomy. Putin responded in Putin style by cracking down on protesters and pushing the narrative through the media that all these people were acting as foreign agents. The separatist movement has gotten so serious that an entire party is now pushing the agenda. The Siberian People's Front organized the Siberian Separatist Congress in 2019, and since then, delegates regularly meet to discuss how they will answer to Moscow's shortfalls. What has further worsened the situation is the fact that Russia has allowed Chinese expansionism into Siberia. It seems that the agenda is to keep Siberians in line, but it has actually made Russians in Siberia angry at Moscow because of how the move has reduced their autonomy. They see China as an economic success story they are not allowed to be a part of, and Moscow as facilitating rather than limiting any Chinese advance. China's Belt and Road Initiative has included Siberia's infrastructure, and a lot of Chinese companies have acquired stakes in Siberian gas, oil, and coal. This has further frustrated Siberia, and for good reason. It's one thing to have your wealth siphoned for your government, but for your government to sit back and watch it happen, that is the cause for an uprising. Siberian culture began to shine again in 2018 with the rise of the so-called Shaman Alexander. He was a symbol of rebellion, and he boldly protested against the corrupt regime, even going as far as calling Putin a demon. The two opinions of him were that he was either a brave man or misguided and psychologically unstable. In 2021, he was arrested at his family compound on the outskirts of Yakutsk, and as if to scare the movement, 9 police cars and over 50 police came to take him away. He was subjected to involuntary psychiatric hospitalization, which was a top punishment for Putin's opposition in the year. In this inhumane care, his health deteriorated, allegedly, and this sparked a lot of criticism for the president's harshness in silencing opposition figures. The move was actually very suspicious as well, because it did not make any sense why an opposition figure so far from Moscow was getting so much attention. His significance is that he made the political movement a spiritual one as well. People everywhere know that the moment you include religion in the mix, people begin to follow movements with cultic loyalty. What his craziness offered the fight was a sense of mystery, and allowed the Siberian people to believe that even their gods wanted them to be free from Russia. Some of Alexander's famous last words were memorialized and reflected in the heart of the movement. To the people of Russia, I say, choose for yourself a normal leader, young, competent. To the leaders of the regions, I say, take care of your local people and the issues that they care about and give them freedom. To the people, I say, don't be afraid of that freedom. We are endlessly paying out. Will our resources last for our grandchildren? Not at the rate we're going. Give simple people bank credit. Let everyone have free education and the chance to choose their careers freely. There should not be prisons, but we in Russia have not achieved this yet. Far from it. Our prisons are terrifying. At least make the prisons humane. For our small businesses, let them flourish before taking taxes from them. Just take taxes from the big, rich businesses. For our agriculture, do not take taxes from people with only a few cows, take only from big agro-business enterprises. What should be worrying for Putin is the fact that even when the matter is not Siberian regionalism, the Siberian region is always at the forefront of fighting the government. In 2023, dozens of residents of Novosibirsk protested against the initiative of the governor of the region to ban rallies in most city places. The reason that the governor was attempting to pass such a law was that the fear that the people would begin to hold protests closer to the elections. If the governor were to continue to have people causing upset in his region, it would not reflect well on him. So he was trying to silence that noise. Unfortunately, as you have seen throughout this video, Novosibirsk is always the center of the rebellion. The protest took place in Neremsky Square, and the authorities agreed with it, but nothing really changed after that. We've been focused on how these movements communicate how unhappy Siberians are, but the talks have made it to secession. If you've been paying attention up until this point, it was all about regionalism. This meant that Russia would still be in control and have oversight in Russia. The escalation to separation is just further evidence of how much Russia has dropped the ball on this one. In 2023, 5 Russian regions began voting in unauthorized independence referendums as part of a campaign to promote secession from Moscow's rule. The online vote was organized by the umbrella group called the Post-Russia Forum, and it covered Siberia, the Urals, Kaliningrad, Krasnodar, and Ingria. Although the referendums are not binding and may be illegal under a law against challenging Russia's territorial integrity, more than 130,000 votes were recorded on the first day of voting. According to the Committee of the Independent Confederation of Siberia, the results were meant to allow the party to understand whether people in Siberia wanted to be free from Moscow. The answer was really obvious, and the cry from the people was, "Siberia will be free." Independence movements like this have continued to grow, and in May of 2022, representatives of 6 provinces united in the form of the League of Free Nations with the aim of seeking the collapse of the Russian Federation and the creation of new states in its ruins. Secession was not always on the agenda, and it has clearly become a last resort. Some people in Moscow were beginning to pay attention to Siberian regionalism, but most in the Kremlin still believe that Siberians were incapable of acting on their own. Russia's current leadership also seems to be convinced that it will be able to counter such moves without making concessions. Because the Kremlin failed to recognize the most important aspect of regionalism in Siberia and the Russian Far East, the move has become bigger. Most provinces were simply wanting self-determination, but the post-Russian Forum was seeking independence for a larger, more diverse group of people. According to Dr. Alexander Etkind, a professor of international relations at the Central European University in Vienna, the referendums helped to build momentum and normalize the idea of secession. For the international community, the potential of a broken-up Russia is both exciting and terrifying. Political scientists argue that the territories of the Russian Federation will, in time, declare independence, like during the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. The obvious plus for most nations is that a broken-down Russian state will reduce its capabilities to attack neighbors. Let's talk about how it would affect China, which shares a border with Siberia. As we know, China is always looking for an opportunity to make some money from a situation. This could be China's opportunity to cut out Moscow and create a long-term supply agreement with Siberia for oil, gas, coal, and timber. China has already been getting handsy in the region of Manchuria, so it's no surprise that it would take the opportunity to siphon more economically. China would also be quick to ensure that it makes Siberia a friend, because this would mean that it does not have to worry about the border that it shares with the region. Anything that reduces Russia's influence increases China's power, and this would make things good enough for Xi. Think about everything that China could do with its Belt and Road Initiative. If economic cooperation increased in the region, this would greatly benefit China's program and increase its influence. America, on the other hand, is a little more skeptical. The Washington Post's David Ignatius feels that this breakaway would provide a devil's playground that could pose a danger to the West. The move would create the space for chaos because if Russia is falling, China is rising. As hard as it may be to believe, given what Putin is doing right now, China is definitely more of a pain than Russia for America. The US can already see the fate of Russia, but China, it's a bit of a wild card. As it stands, the US is already planning on war with China based on its plans to enter Taiwan. If Siberia becomes independent and creates its own regional order, the US will have to change its foreign policy to meet the changes there. At this stage, we can confidently predict that Moscow will respond the way that it has always done, with force. It has been unwilling to go the diplomatic route with Siberia all this time, and it is highly unlikely that this is the moment that it will choose to hear reason. Putin's response has always been very clear, and he believes that all separatist movements are an attempt to undermine Russian territorial integrity. The media propaganda that he has always pushed is that these are attempts by outside parties to sabotage Russia. In an address in 2023, Putin stated, "The attempts by foreign special agents to destabilize the political and social situations in Russia must be severely stopped. Security services have no easy task, but you have all the necessary potential, all the possibilities, in order to ensure the security of the state, of society, of our citizens." Amnesty International has identified how Russia operates when faced with opposition and lays it out clearly. The face of the pro-Russia movement is always the Russian armed forces, and Putin always uses them to attack and abuse the people. The next step then is to criminalize any protests by passing absurd laws that make it impossible for anyone to freely express their views. The criminal justice system is also used by the government to run unfair trials and to dish out crazy prison sentences with heavy fines. In 2022, over 21,000 individuals in Russia were penalized for such offenses, with 2,307 given administrative detention and the rest heavy fines. Most of these people participated in peaceful street protests or critiqued the regime on the internet. The turning point in this decade for the move towards secession is the war in Ukraine. To add to its many crimes against Siberia, Putin's war has also negatively impacted the region. The death toll in the provinces and the impact of sanctions made everything worse and left the Siberians feeling like they were helpless. Many of the people who were suffering from abject poverty decided to go to the war in Ukraine to at least make money. In an interview with Radio Liberty, one woman explained that her husband did not return after going to the war to make some money. Another woman explained her son's situation, stating that after he returned from Ukraine after completing his contract, he only got a fraction of the $2,200, about 200,000 ruble, that he was promised. On top of that, he was told that he could potentially be pulled back into the contract even though there were delays in payments and people were getting underpaid. The Ukrainian war has also breathed new life into a lot of separatist movements in Russia. Ukraine is the only country in the world that openly supports these movements and has welcomed support from them in fighting in the war on their side. The Siberian Volunteer Battalion was created at the end of October of 2023, and it was part of the International Legion under the Main Intelligence Directorate of the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine. Before the battalion, there were two other units of Russians under the Freedom of Russia Legion and the Russian Volunteer Corps. The Siberian Battalion's job was territorial defense, and most indigenous peoples of the Trans-Urals, Siberia, and the far north were part of this group. But they were also ethnic Russians. All of them have one thing in common. They do not agree with Russia's war in Ukraine, and they do not want to be complicit. The fact that the battalion is made up of mostly volunteers is clear proof that Siberia is in support of the demise of Moscow. So what will happen when Putin inevitably surrenders? The first scenario is that they will call for an increase in autonomy as they transition to independence. At this stage, Putin is too weak to fight back, which means that the separation will be met with minimal pushback. With the backing of Ukraine and possibly the West, Siberia could even eventually become an internationally recognized state. The secession might not happen directly after the war ends, but an analysis of the climate shows that it would be in the best interest of everyone involved to jump ship while the ship is sinking. Moscow's biggest mistake was its erasure of Siberian identity. The region was not ambitious in any way. All it wanted was to benefit from the wealth of the region and to feel like it was a part of Russia, but it was left feeling like an outsider. After its cry for recognition and regional autonomy was rejected, the next step was a separatist movement. This is because Siberia realized that it needed to take matters into its own hands if it wanted to develop and grow. Things have begun to erupt now, but throughout the years, there were signs. From the I Am Siberian movement to the Stop Feeding Moscow slogans and protests, it was very clear that this group of people was unhappy. When you choose to ignore a problem for long enough, it eventually will erupt in your face. As Siberia watches other successful separatist movements like those in Chechnya and the Northern Caucasus, it is taking notes and building up the courage to make a move. Losing Ukraine will do Putin in, but Siberia breaking away is going to truly be his undoing.
As Russia continues to experience losses in the Russo-Ukrainian war, China is ready to take advantage of the situation and grab back its prized land, Manchuria. Everybody is convinced that China is gunning for Taiwan next, but in a little bit, you're going to see things differently. A lot of you are probably hearing about Manchuria for the first time and have a lot of questions about this specific territory and why it's so important to China. This contention is a piece of a bigger puzzle that many of us are not privy to. Our knowledge of world history is limited to the 2000s, and because we don't know how far these tensions go, we don't understand the now. In a video like this, we are exposing the CCP's schemes, and as you can expect, they are not very happy about this. CCP bots are constantly under our videos every day, trying to downvote them and push them back. To keep our content circulating, please give this video a like and share it with your friends and family. Before China and Russia were even a thing, there was Manchuria, with its earliest known inhabitants being a Mongolic tribe. They were a nomadic group of people who many believe were the ancestors of the Manchu people. Imperialism grabbed hold of the world, and Manchuria was initially conquered by the three kingdoms of Korea. In the 12th century, Genghis Khan took over Manchuria and incorporated it into the Mongol Empire. We remember Genghis Khan, right? He was the emperor of one of the biggest empires in the world, and one of the most feared leaders of the 12th century. This empire that he built included northern China, Central Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. That is basically the whole of Asia today. If you have heard about him, it's probably in line with his brutal policy of massacres and the enslavement of the people he conquered. But as with all ambitious imperial movements, that time came to an end, and then the Qing dynasty began its reign of Manchuria between 1644 and 1912. The Qing dynasty actually came from the Manchu people, who set up Manchuria as their power base. The economic growth that came from that time in the area of agriculture and trade really set up China, and between 1736 and 1796, the empire began to expand to Tibet and Mongolia. Unfortunately, things began to sour for China between 1839 and 1949, and history remembers that period as the century of humiliation. During the 110-year period, everything China had built began to crumble, and all the other foreign nations began to divide China's territories amongst each other. It all started with the Opium Wars that opened China's markets. And then rebellions like the Taiping Rebellion in 1842 and the Boxer Rebellion in 1899 weakened the Chinese Empire. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 was one of the biggest blows, and China lost Korea and Taiwan after that war. As all this went down, Russia was watching as everyone tore at China and took the opportunity to take a piece for itself. The reason it did this was because it was still reeling from the Mongol conquest that tried to take it in the 13th century, so this was the opportunity for it to hit back. During the century, Britain took Hong Kong and the Japanese conquered Taiwan and Manchuria. Even in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party rose to power, it was still bound to unequal treaties that it had signed during its season of desperation. The Russian Empire seized the opportunity by lining up tens of thousands of its troops on the border with China and demanded that the king cede a huge piece of its land that was then known as Outer Manchuria, and they first signed the Treaty of Aigun in 1858. This treaty gave Russia control of the Amur River, the territory east of the Ussuri River and the Sea of Okhotsk River. After that, China was cut again by the next treaty in 1860, called the Convention of Peking, in which China surrendered a piece of territory that was the size of Ukraine. This region included the Primorsky Kai territory and the Khabarovsk territory, which is a large chunk of Manchuria today. If you are looking for the moment that changed Sino-Russian relations forever, this was it. This 1860 treaty that China signed under duress locked China out of access to the Sea of Japan and instead restricted it to the East and South China Sea. Many Chinese nationalists have not forgotten this injustice and have always believed that Outer Manchuria belongs to China. In 1904, China's irritation with Russia increased when it lost Manchuria to Japan. China then lost control of the whole of Manchuria in 1931 till 1945, when Japan also invaded China. Post-Second World War, the Chinese Communist Party set itself up, and the Sino-Russian conflict began. China tried its best to fix things with Russia, and in 1963, it proposed to the Russian government that they should revisit their unequal treaty and resolve their border dispute issue. Unfortunately, the Soviet side was not hearing it. The USSR refused to acknowledge the existence of the border dispute and insisted that the past treaties were equal. Mao Zedong was not happy about this, and in 1964, during a dialogue with Sasaki Kozo and others from the Japanese Socialist Party in Beijing, he said that he felt that the Soviet occupation of Manchuria was too wide and that Russia should not have control of Lake Baikal, such as Khabarovsk, Vladivostok, and the Kamchatka Peninsula. Unfortunately for Mao, these comments leaked, and Moscow was outraged by everything that Mao had said. The tensions began to rise, and China started to manipulate its ideological differences with Russia to start up some trouble. This led to the Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969 along the Amur and Ussuri rivers, which was along the boundary of Outer Manchuria. In March of 1969, China claimed an island on Russia's side of the Ussuri River known as Damansky, and hundreds of Chinese and Soviet troops battled against each other for control over the island, with mass casualties being reported. Yuri Sologub, a Russian soldier, recalled how serious the fight got. 18 combat vehicles fired a salvo, and 720 100-kilogram artillery rockets were launched towards the target in a matter of just a few minutes. When the smoke cleared, everyone saw that not a single shell hit the island. All 720 rockets flew 5 to 7 kilometers further, deep into Chinese territory, and smashed a village with all the headquarters, rear services, and hospitals with everything that was there at the time. That is why everything went so quiet. The Chinese did not expect such impudence from us. Moscow was confused by how big the battle was getting, considering that it was allegedly over a small island. Over 500,000 Chinese soldiers were deployed near their border, and Russia began to believe that this fight had to do with the comments Mao made in 1964. Luckily, the crisis never came to war, and the border was officially demarcated in 1991 when the two countries' militaries withdrew. Both countries seemed to reach an agreement, and China even got Damansky Island, but China still felt like it should have gotten the whole of Manchuria back. It is very clear that it has carried over these feelings to the present day. Have we ever considered why China still refers to the territories as Outer Manchuria? It is because even though the territory has Russian names, with cities like Vladivostok and Khabarovsk, China still believes that this is Chinese territory. In any case, despite these underlying issues, Sino-Russian relations got significantly better after 1991. The two countries had already begun to improve their diplomatic relationships, and in 1989, Mikhail S. Gorbachev visited Beijing to seal the reconciliation between the two communist nations. In 1994, the then Russian President Boris Yeltsin returned the favor and visited China too. After his meeting, he proposed extending the free trade zone around the border area and expressed that he was happy that things were getting better between the two countries. From 1996 to 2001, they moved from a strategic partnership to a friendship. In 1996, China and Russia signed the Strategic Partnership Agreement, and Russia stood behind China politically when it was pushing its One China agenda. In 2001, they signed the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, which was a 20-year strategy signed by Chinese President Jiang Zemin and Russian President Vladimir Putin. It broadly laid out agreements for cooperation and geopolitical assistance. But Article 9 of the agreement deserves attention. Article 9 of the treaty was basically a defense impact, which stated that when a situation arose in which the peace of one of the contracting parties was threatened or there were threats of aggression, the two countries would meet immediately to hold consultations to determine how to, quote-unquote, eliminate such threats. On June 28, 2021, the treaty was renewed for another 5 years, and since then, China and Russia have signed a lot of other agreements. In 2022, when President Xi and Putin met on the sideline of the Beijing Olympics, Xi declared that their partnership had no limits, and China agreed to stand with Russia against NATO's alleged aggression. The partnership between the two leaders had gotten so close that Western intelligence reports indicate that Chinese officials knew in early February about Russia's planned invasion and asked Russia to wait until after the Beijing Olympics had finished before beginning. As you guys have seen, we are trying our best to up the production value on the channel. We want to make more of these types of videos and aim to do even better. These videos take a lot of time and thousands of dollars to make, but often they cover topics that are not advertiser friendly, and that's why YouTube often demonetizes our videos. As you can see on your screen, a demonetized video makes very little money compared to what it costs. But we want to continue covering topics like this one, even if advertisers don't like it. We like doing it, and hopefully you guys like watching. That's why we have opened up a Patreon and membership. That way you can support our content directly and help us continue doing what we love. So if you are able to, you can support us by joining our Patreon or becoming a member on YouTube. QR codes are on the screen and links are in the description. Your support is greatly appreciated. Maybe for the good faith of the relationship, China could forget about Manchuria, right? Well, the truth is that this is not a possibility for a number of reasons. Manchuria's strategic location is one of the reasons why China is hell-bent on fighting to get it back. This is because Manchuria would grant China proximity to Japan and the Korean Peninsula. For a moment, let us think about the increased US military presence in and around South Korea and Japan. Having Manchuria is ideal for China because it counters US influence in the area and allows China to build economic relations in the region. It also gives China back its long-lost access to the Sea of Japan and the Pacific Ocean, which fits into China's expansionist agenda. We hinted at it in the history, but we need to talk about how rich and profitable the Manchurian region is. In Daqing and Songliao, there is major production of oil and gas, which are significant contributors to China's energy production. Mineral resources like coal and iron are also a big part of the wealth in the southwest, where there is a large colliery at Fushun and a large steel mill at Anshan. Other minerals like magnesite, copper, lead, and zinc are found in Manchuria, with reports that uranium and gold deposits being found too. Agriculture is also a big part of Manchuria's economy, and the Great Manchurian Plain that crosses the Liao and Songhua rivers is fertile and densely populated and has become the agricultural center of China. Sweet potatoes, beans, cereals like rice, wheat, and millet, cotton, flax, and sugar beets are the primary crops grown in the region, and China produces enough of these to export. Another important feature that Manchuria has going for it is its rail network that connects China, Japan, North Korea, and Russia. South Manchuria Railway Company was established in 1906 with the purpose of connecting Changchun and Dalian, which was a major port city. From there, the railway expanded and was connected to the Chinese Eastern Railway, which was built by Russia. The railway was used for the transportation of goods in these early days, especially soybeans, which were a major export for Manchuria. This network was a game changer for economic growth and trade in the region, and it also became a big part of expanding coal mining and steel production industries for China. The problem that China has is that parts of this railway still belong to Russia. The Russia Far Eastern Railway is still connected to the Chinese railway network, meaning that it benefits from this logistical masterpiece. Although they have had some joint agreements to connect Russia's Rast Eastern Federal District to China's Heilongjiang, the railway is a source of competition between the two countries. Russia is continuously trying to maintain control of market share, and China is trying to cut its access off. From an economic and logistics perspective, China has a lot to gain from pushing for full control of the territory. About 10% of China's GDP is accounted for by Manchuria's production, which is quite a large chunk. Russia has tried to make the region one where both countries get to eat, but China is fighting for full control. China is not looking to see Russia prosper, especially considering what Putin has been doing in recent years. As a border region, Manchuria has great military significance, with the PLA setting up quite a number of bases in the territory. Harbin, which is a major city in the Heilongjiang region, is the headquarters for military activity in the region. The Harbin Jiayao Air Base hosts the PLA Air Force's 30th Fighter Division, and the Harbin Radar Station monitors the airspace and detects missiles. It was very important to China for it to set up military infrastructure in the region because of how close it is to well-known military heavyweights. The investment that China has put into fortifying the area is proof of a long-term plan that China has to branch out into Russia's share of the area. We have talked about all these features of Manchuria to show why it is lucrative for China, but the reason that Beijing is willing to go to war for Manchuria is largely sentimental. China is coming for every single country that kicked it when it was down, and it hasn't forgotten what Russia did during the century of humiliation. From a nationalist perspective, most of the people in Manchuria are Chinese who speak the language and are a part of the culture. Russia's claim over the region is purely based on what China deems as quote-unquote unequal treaties, and China wants to use this opportunity that the Ukrainian war has given to rewrite these historical wrongs. On the face of it, Sino-Russian relations are doing a-okay, but we need to remember one thing. In geopolitics, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. Currently, China and Russia interests are aligning, and they are simply riding the wave of their quote-unquote friendship. Earlier on, we spoke about the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation, but China and Russia have bound each other by so many more strategic agreements. After the renewal of their friendship agreement in 2021, China and Russia signed energy cooperation agreements that included oil and gas contracts for joint energy projects. In 2022, the two countries released a joint statement expressing that they were entering a new era of global sustainable development. One of the important outcomes of the discussions was the positive talks about plans for development of the Eurasian Economic Union and the Belt and Road Initiative, with the aim being to intensify cooperation between the EAEU and China. Both China and Russia share a dream for greater Eurasian partnership that works together with the Belt and Road construction, which we will get into later. Russia also made it a point to reaffirm its support of the One China policy and boldly declared that Taiwan was an inalienable part of China and opposed its declaration of independence. Both nations also indirectly condemned Japan and the US, stating that the external forces that were meddling in the region were undermining the security of China. The two countries also used this moment to call out NATO loud and clear. The statement read, "The sides oppose further enlargement of NATO and call on the North Atlantic allegiance to abandon its ideologized Cold War approaches, to respect the sovereignty, security, and interests of other countries, the diversity of their civilizational, cultural, and historical backgrounds, and to exercise a fair and objective attitude towards the peaceful developments of other states. The sides stand against the formation of closed bloc structures and opposing camps in the Asia-Pacific region, and remain highly vigilant about the negative impact of the United States' Indo-Pacific strategy on peace and stability in the region." Like Russia, China believes that America is a bully and NATO is the lapdog that does all its dirty work, but it also has a personal vendetta from 1999. China holds a very strong grudge against NATO because of something that happened in 1999. NATO was working to fight against Serbian aggression towards Albanians and dropped a B-2 bomber on the Chinese embassy on May 7th. Dropping the bomb on the embassy was a mistake, but 3 Chinese nationalists were killed and 20 were injured. China does not believe that this was a simple miscalculation and has always suspected foul play. Since then, the US has been public enemy number 1, and China's foreign policy is very anti-American. Both Xi and Putin crave a redemption story and are driven by a desire to prove themselves as formidable forces in the international community. China's century of humiliation and the collapse of the Soviet Union were embarrassing times for these two countries in the global communities, and they are looking for payback against the Western powers that made them the laughingstock. China and Russia have maintained the quote-unquote us against the world agenda, and even in the midst of most of the world blacklisting Russia, China is still trading with Russia. When it was accused of doing this, China defended itself, stating that it was not selling any lethal arms to Moscow and that all it traded were dual goods. These dual goods are a loophole because they are goods that both civilians and the military can use. According to the Carnegie Endowment think tank, Beijing has exported over $300 million worth of dual-use items to Russia every month. This graph shows that trade between China and Russia has rapidly grown in the past couple of years. In 2023, trade reached a record of $240 billion, which is 64% more than in 2021, and Russian imports from China were $111 billion, and its exports to China were $129 billion. At a meeting in Beijing, Putin confidently stated that Russia uses the yuan for 90% of its trade, instead of the US dollar. Well, with all the economic sanctions Russia is facing, it doesn't have much of a choice. Currently, Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's largest oil supplier, and China has overtaken Germany as Russia's largest trading partner. Their existing relationship as trade partners means that their partnership is quite solid. Where there is money to be made, there are friendships to be built as well. As recently as September 2024, in the middle of everything happening in Ukraine, Russia and China have been carrying out joint military drills. Ocean 202 was a 7-day drill exercise that included military exercises and joint patrols between Russia and China. This is after Xi vowed that the two countries would tighten military cooperation between the two countries. Beijing sent out several warships and about 15 aircraft to Russia's far east coast for Ocean 2024, and the two countries' militaries carried out joint naval drills in the waters near Japan. Washington openly expressed its frustration and fears at the developments, stating how worrying it was that Russia and China were cooperating so closely.
White House says it's still concerned about collaboration between Russia and China after their joint show of force near Alaska. In a first, Chinese bombers joined Russian planes to conduct a patrol together before being intercepted by U.S. and Canadian fighter jets. CNN's Natasha Bertrand has details from the Pentagon.
Russian and Chinese bombers were intercepted by U.S. and Canadian fighter jets off the coast of Alaska on Tuesday, in what marked the first time that Russian and Chinese bombers have operated in this area. And while the bombers did not necessarily come close to the United States or Canada, they stayed roughly 200 miles away from the coastline. It was still a concerning development, according to U.S. officials, because, of course, it showcases just how closely now the Russians and the Chinese are operating together, and the fact that the Chinese are now sending bombers, it appears, to this area, which is known as Alaska's Air Defense Identification Zone. It is still technically international airspace, but any time a foreign entity enters that zone, the U.S. does respond by scrambling jets and intercepting those flights. And so while there was never any risk that was posed to the United States or Canada, according to a statement from NORAD, it is still, important for U.S. officials to be able to show the Chinese and the Russians that they are able to track them and monitor them in real time. And Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, he did speak to this. He said that it was not a surprise to the U.S. that this was occurring, because the U.S. was able to monitor these bombers really the entire time that they were in the zone, that air defense identification zone, and even before that. But still, it obviously is a sign of just how closely the Russian and Chinese militaries are cooperating now, and clearly it was also meant as a sign and a show of strength by the Russian and Chinese militaries to convey to the U.S. that they are now working together in an area where the Chinese really have not been present before, in the Arctic, near that air defense identification zone. So something that the U.S. is watching very closely here.
What is even more unusual is how well the two presidents get along. Most foreign relations are fostered for the good of the country, but outside of the shared agenda, the two leaders seem to genuinely like each other. Xi has described Putin as his best friend, and they are often spotted doing things that would be considered a little unconventional for two presidents to do when they meet. This should not come as much of a shock, considering how similar the two leaders are. They share similarities in their ideologies, and both governments are autocratic in nature, with the power being centralized in the hands of the leader. Now, despite this show of chumminess, there are a few things that have made China's true feelings about Russia a bit obvious. At Russia's lowest, when every single ruble counts, China has begun to undercut Russia's oil prices, and there are ongoing disputes about gas prices between the two nations. In its heydays, Russia used to export about 200 billion cubic meters of oil, but due to economic sanctions, it is forced to divert its oil sales to China. Originally, the price for a barrel was $82, but a price cap was placed on Russia's exports, only allowing those who choose to still trade with Russia to pay $60. You would expect that China would be more than happy to pay the cap price, but currently a barrel of Urals crude oil, which is Russia's main blend of oil, is selling at $49.50 a barrel. This is because trade partners like China and India have taken advantage of the sanctions and negotiated for lower prices. This moment has very eerie similarities with what happened centuries ago when Russia took advantage of the weakening Qing dynasty to further its own ambitions. Furthermore, as the Biden administration began to squeeze China for more assistance for Russia, economic cooperation has fallen. It began with Russian businesses complaining that there had been delays in payments with Chinese trading partners and that large sums of money were being suspiciously withheld. All of a sudden, there seemed to be heavy scrutiny of transactions with Russian companies, and the payments were being held back by Chinese state banks. Then, in August 2024, China blindsided Russia by carrying out a massive shutdown of Russian transactions worth billions of yuan. All cross-border payments to China stopped, and the trade volumes fell drastically. China's abrupt 180 had to do with the fact that its alliance with Russia was beginning to cause problems for it. The US made it very clear that if China keeps helping out Russian businesses on the sanctions list, they will be hit with secondary sanctions. China has to think about its economy too, and right now, it cannot afford to be on America's bad side. Many companies in China rely on American and European markets for trade, and there are currently 265 Chinese companies on the US stock exchange, with a total market value of $848 billion. As compliance has tightened in 2024, even import numbers have dropped. Russia's imports from China have fallen more than 1% to $62 billion, and its central bank forecasts the country's total imports dropping globally by 3% in 2024. For the most part, there are no hard feelings, and China is doing business. But the truth is that Xi is becoming irritated with the way Russia is moving. With each new phase in the war, China is afraid that it will be roped into the fight on Russia's side if the West steps in. And it is not in China's best interests to be engaged in a global war right now. Putin has become very self-destructive, and China is afraid that it will go down with it. Xi also realizes that it is in his best interest that Putin stays in power. I mean, he has spent so much time investing in the relationship, and the fall of Putin would mean a disruption in the status quo that would then lead to a new successor who may not be in alignment with China's agenda. To further prove China's hidden agenda against Russia, there are reports that China has been using hackers to spy on the Russian state. We all know that Chinese espionage is at an all-time high, but you would think that its ally would be spared. Chinese hackers have targeted dozens of computers belonging to Russian state agencies and tech companies, and reports are coming out that malicious tools have been implanted. The Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky picked up an unknown plug-wide backdoor and an updated version of cloud sorcerer malware, which was previously used to spy on Russian organizations. The spyware has been previously identified and linked to the Beijing-linked hacking group APT31. Although there is nothing concrete to prove these allegations, the possibility that it could be true is enough to sow distrust. Yes, China's ambition for Manchuria is part of taking back what belongs to it, but it all plays into China's long-term strategy in Northeast Asia. Have you ever heard of China's Belt and Road Initiative? The BRI is a massive plan that China has to link East Asia and Europe through one common transport line. The project is sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road, and it has been central to President Xi's foreign policy, which he launched in 2013. The original Silk Road was a product of China's Han Dynasty. The road was a trade network through present-day Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, India, and Pakistan to the south. This is over 4,000 miles from Europe right now. The road put Central Asia at the epicenter of globalization, and it was at the forefront of connecting Eastern and Western markets together. Through this network, China was able to push valuable Chinese silk, jade, and other goods, while it received gold and other precious metals, ivory, and glass products. In 2013, President Xi set his plan in motion during his official visit to Kazakhstan and Indonesia. He pitched his idea for the New Silk Road, highlighting how profitable it would be for everyone involved. In his speech, he stated, "If our region can realize local currency convertibility and settle under current and capital accounts, it will significantly lower circulation costs, increase our ability to fend off financial risks, and make our region more economically competitive in the world." The plan was to create a Silk Road economic belt and the Maritime Silk Road. Initially, it was referred to as One Belt, One Road Initiative, but eventually it became Belt and Road Initiative. Xi's vision included creating a vast network of railways, energy pipelines, highways, and streamlined border crossings both westward through the mountainous former Soviet republics and southward to Pakistan, India, and the rest of Southeast Asia. After Xi's initial announcement, he announced his plan subsequently at the 2013 summit of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in Indonesia. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations is a regional grouping amongst 10 members: Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, that aims to promote economic and security cooperation. It was very strategic for Xi to lay out his plan there, and it helped him build his membership to the point that it is today. On top of the rail and road network, China also wanted to expand maritime trade traffic by investing in port development along the Indian Ocean, from Southeast Asia all the way to East Africa and parts of Europe. China's investments have paid off, and as of December 2023, there are 147 countries under the Belt and Road Initiative. This map shows how much of the world is under BRI. Of the 147, 44 countries are in Sub-Saharan Africa, 34 countries are in Europe and Central Asia, 25 countries are in East Asia and Pacific, 22 countries are in Latin America and Caribbean, 19 countries are in the Middle East and North Africa, and 6 countries are in Southeast Asia. This large portion of the world makes up about 2/3 of the world's population and 40% of global GDP. On top of building the infrastructure, China also funded economic zones that went into promoting job employment and bettering the conditions for developing countries. On the front of it, the desire was also to expand the international use of Chinese currency. And while it is undeniable that what China has done has benefited a lot of people from this initiative, there's definitely a hidden agenda behind this for China. The move of this initiative has actually been to assert China more dominantly on the world stage. BRI is basically how China plans to push back against US influence. And at the end of the day, it is about boosting Chinese income, exports, and production capacity. China is basically trying to redraw trade maps the same way that it randomly redraws territorial maps on a regular basis. On this new map, China is the center of trade, not Europe or the US. China is also using its influence in the BRI to streamline its Made in China 2025 project, which is a government plan to grow China's manufacturing base by rapidly developing 10 high-tech industries like electric cars, telecommunications, advanced robotics, and artificial intelligence. The plan has two parts: completely remove China's reliance on foreign markets and create a sort of monopoly for China in global markets. China is also secretly creating leverage for itself. In 2021, a study done on over 100 debt financing contracts revealed that there were clauses in the contracts that takes away the country's ability to work with the Paris Club, which is basically 22 countries in the West. China also has the ability to retain the right to demand repayment at any time, and this is a way that China can force countries to push its agendas or force them to buy into its One China policy. All of this should not come as a surprise at all, considering the fact that no help or assistance is ever freely given. But where does Manchuria play into all of this? Well, Manchuria is basically the heartbeat of China's scheme. Due to its rich resource center, it is economically a big part of the project. BRI projects have included the China-Russia Railway Bridge that has connected Manchuria to Russia and the China-Mongolia-Russia corridor that has enhanced trade for the three nations. From Manchuria, China has pushed to increase trade in Central Asia, Mongolia, and North Korea. We must not kid ourselves into believing that Russia has just been a bystander as all of this has been happening. Economically, Russia benefits from the Belt and Road Initiative, so it has played along and even praised Xi for the initiative. A Russian state news agency quoted Putin saying, "We see that some perceive it as an attempt by the People's Republic of China to crush someone under itself, but we don't see this that way. We just see a desire for cooperation." Putin is not stupid, and he understands that he has to dance for his supper. Underneath the facade of pretending like he's behind China, he sees the problem with the BRI. The Kremlin recognizes that this initiative is in competition with its own Trans-Siberian Railway network and its agenda of connecting its region through rail. The only reason that Russia has piped down on its opposition to the BRI is because China has allowed the linking of the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a Russian initiative. Under this initiative, China has accepted that the EAEU will be a full and equal partner to Beijing in the region, as Russia attaches great significance to the EAEU in this section. Even though this concession has been made, Russia still understands that this move by China is a dilution of its influence. The only issue is that it currently is not in a position to fight back, considering its current economic crisis and the effect of the Western sanctions. In relation to China's ambitions for Manchuria, Russia has chosen to play dumb. In a recent interview on a Taiwanese TV program, Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te boldly declared that China was not driven by territorial integrity, but rather by a desire to change the world. He then went on to say that instead of focusing on annexing Taiwan, China needed to focus on the fact that it gave up large tracts of Manchuria to Russia. His argument was that China had more of a claim in Manchuria than it did in Taiwan, and that it should pursue its business there. Russia's immediate response was to make Taiwan's statement seem insane. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova criticized Lai's statement and stated that the claim was absurd, and China and Russia had settled the border in a 2004 agreement. According to Zakharova, Beijing was in agreement with the parts of Manchuria that Russia had ceded. Zakharova even went as far as stating that Lai was, quote-unquote, being pushed toward separatism by the Americans. Russia is supposedly extremely confident in its friendship with Beijing and believes that they are on the same page. It is unclear if Russia is just playing the diplomacy game really well or if it actually believes what it's saying. It would be worrying if Russia is not even anticipating that China may have territorial ambitions in the region. This means that when China eventually does exact its plan for Manchuria, Russia will be blindsided. Well, the rest of the world seems a lot more clued up than Russia is, and that is why the US and NATO have been very intentional about countering China's power. Think about it. The spotlight has currently been on Putin, so we have been unable to see how much of an actual villain China is. China's expansionist tendencies are visible on so many fronts. You have its fights with Taiwan, its issues in the South China Sea, its issues with India along its border, and some scuffles with Japan. The US sees China's BRI initiative as a Trojan horse that China is going to use for its military expansion. To counter the creation of the BRI, in 2021, Biden and the other members of the G7 launched the Build Back Better World Initiative. The aim of its project was to provide an alternative to BRI for middle to low-income countries. It was basically marketing itself as a private school version of the BRI, with goals like investing in clean energy and strengthening health security. Unfortunately, the project has not taken off as well as expected. This is because it did not manage to gather enough funding to actively compete with the BRI. A year after it was launched, the initiative only managed to raise about $6 million. It has undergone a rebrand and is now called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. Both Russia and China have worked hard to paint NATO and the US as aggressive and greedy, but in reality, the whole point of collective defense has been to counter the movement of countries like Russia, North Korea, and China. Outside of the US, two other countries have been able to see China's ambitions for what it is: India and Japan. From the beginning, India has tried to sound the alarm on China's agenda, referring to it as the String of Pearls geoeconomic strategy. According to India, China is trying to establish its network of ports and rail to dominate Asia and push India's dominance in the Indian Ocean. To do this, China creates unsustainable debt burdens for its Indian Ocean neighbors in order to seize control of regional choke points, and it has even gone as far as becoming partners with India's rival, Pakistan. India has been very proactive in fighting against this and has begun to start its own infrastructure projects with neighbors like Afghanistan. The United States has also allied with India because it views it as a counterweight to a China-dominated Asia. Like India, Japan has been balancing its interests as well by developing regional infrastructure development like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, which basically aims to develop a network that connects Myanmar to East Africa. Japan is so committed to this agenda that it has pledged over $300 billion in public and private financing to infrastructure projects throughout Asia. India and Japan have been working together on this project with hopes of countering China's ambitions. Other states that have been critical of China's ambitions include France, which has stated that the alleged partner countries in the BRI are more like vassal states, and that they should be careful about what they are getting themselves into. The international community's fear is that China's ambitions will continue to grow, and imperialism may begin again if countries do not work together to balance out its influence. The next coming months are what will turn supposed conspiracy theorists into analysts. It is not hard to read China, and one thing that is guaranteed is that they are opportunists. Everybody has been convinced that China's first victim in its territorial expansion mission would be Taiwan, but this could not be further from the truth. Diane Francis explains that China's plan for Taiwan was never an invasion, and the agenda was to create a one-country, two-system deal. Unfortunately, now that Taiwan has rejected this, China has moved on to other ambitions. The current geopolitical context makes it the perfect time for China to take Manchuria back. For one, no one in the international community will stand by Russia, and Moscow is in no shape to retaliate. Putin is entering into his 4th year of war soon, which is a bad omen, and China has begun to make it very clear which side it's standing on. Recently at the BRICS summit, President Xi spoke up and stated that there should be no escalation of fighting in Ukraine. He stated that as the crisis drags on, 3 principles need to be kept: no spillover from the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no adding oil to the fire by relevant parties. This was definitely a dig at North Korea that has sent troops into Russia, and it does not help that China is unhappy about the budding relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. As the Russian ship begins to sink, China has already positioned itself as a neutral party and will be able to benefit from Moscow falling. It has been holding on to this agenda for 200 years, and this is the perfect time for it to take back the land. In her Times radio interview, Diane Francis made it clear that she believes that the Russian Federation will collapse after the war in Ukraine. She added, "China is very much involved in what happens to Russia after this is over. Many of us speculate that once the center doesn't hold and they lose the war, whoever replaces Putin is not going to be able to hold on to 11 time zones of the nation. It is just too big a country. At the far east edge is Manchuria, which was stolen from China over 100 years ago. They want Manchuria back, and they are going to get it." Things have gotten so bad for Russia that it has to rely on assistance from North Korean troops. In October 2024, South Korea reported that North Korean troops were in Ukraine and that about 6 North Korean officers had been killed in a Ukrainian missile strike near Donetsk on October 3rd. Some leaked audio was intercepted by the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, revealing Russian soldiers, raising concerns about how North Korean soldiers will be commanded and provided with ammunition and military kit. There have been differing accounts as to the number of soldiers in Ukraine, but there is no doubt that North Korea is fighting the war on Russia's side. The White House has said that there are at least 3,000 troops, while Ukrainian President Zelensky stated that 10,000 soldiers are being prepared for deployment. This clear escalation by Putin is really just clear proof that the whole war has become a train wreck. China has already begun to position itself to sell out Putin by maintaining that it does not want to be a part of the mess. Adding North Korea into the mix is dangerous, as it proves the belief that there's going to be a Russia, North Korea, Iran, China axis in this war. Chinese officials have already made it clear to Newsweek that Beijing is looking to de-escalate the war, and it is not happy about the reports that North Korean troops have entered the war. In a statement released by Chinese U.S. Embassy, China made it very clear that it hopes that all the parties in the Ukraine crisis are working towards de-escalation, and China is hoping for a political settlement. What does not help the situation even more is the fact that North Korean soldiers have just arrived on the scene, but they are already losing ground. Days after arrival, reports show that 18 North Korean soldiers deserted the Russian front line, and the Russian troops have been looking for them ever since. The troops were deployed to Kursk and were supposed to be part of the agenda to push Ukraine out of the region. Well, what does this mean for China, and how will it carry out its plan to take back Manchuria? China is simply biding its time and waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. There is a lot that it has to consider in relation to when and how it strikes. Currently, it has vested interests in Russia, and its economic investments need to be protected. At the same time, its alliance is still beneficial, so it is all about waiting for the right time. Should it wait until Russia is significantly weakened or strike only once the war is completely ended? All of these things are points to consider as Beijing maps out how it is going to get its territory back. Russia's current frontline losses are increasing, and it is clear that Putin is going to lose this war. It has made some desperate last-ditch attempts, like giving away land to China for equipment and signing military pacts with North Korea for military personnel. Putin is way over his head now, and the war that was only supposed to last a couple of weeks is about to close its third year. China is too smart to go down with Putin, and it has been thinking about how it can leverage its allies' loss for its territorial benefits. By aligning with the countries that are calling for de-escalation, China is preparing for the time when the spoils of war will be divided, and it will be given the opportunity to take back Manchuria once and for all.
As if there is not enough going on in Ukraine, Lithuania is preparing to go into a full-on war with Russia. And as usual, it's all Putin's fault. This is Kaliningrad, a small Russian administrative division in the Baltics that Putin has been using to try and wiggle its way into Lithuania and the Baltic states. The Russian president has a way of messing with everything he touches, and now his aggressive push into Ukraine is going to ruin the mutual understanding that Lithuania and Kaliningrad had established. In fact, the relationship between these two areas has suffered so much that Lithuania's defense minister, Liudas Kasčiūnas, has stated that $648 million will be set aside for mass defense fortifications in light of this impending war. What makes this war different from any other regional conflict, and what Putin may have failed to account for, is the fact that, unlike Ukraine, Lithuania is a member of NATO, which means that this little war in Kaliningrad could drag the US and the rest of NATO's heavy hitters right to Putin's doorstep. We have been reporting on the Russian-Ukrainian war for some time now, and as our community, you have stood by us faithfully. Unfortunately, in recent months, we have been struggling to push our content because Putin bots and the algorithm have been downvoting our videos. You can help us by liking our videos and sharing them with your community too. Okay, let us get into today's video. As Lithuania prepares for massive offense, the Queen Louis Bridge, which stands between Lithuania and Kaliningrad, has been closed. Lithuania has begun to build fortifications to stop Kaliningrad tanks from coming over it in the next coming weeks. Landmines will be buried along the crossing to blow up anyone who dares to ignore the boundaries. The bridge, which used to be a symbol of good faith between the two territories, has now become heavily patrolled, and the Lithuania Border Guard Service has declared that the country has raised its surveillance to the maximum level. Putin will, no doubt, match that effort, since he simply cannot, under any circumstances, afford to lose Kaliningrad. If this small Russian administrative falls, then it is no exaggeration to say that Russia as a whole will be instantly doomed. However, before we get into that, let's go over the history of the land in detail. Most of you probably have never heard about this little region, but it is an important piece of the war puzzle. Kaliningrad is a Russian exclave, which means that it belongs to Russia, but it's not in Russia. Take a look at this map again. Kaliningrad is nestled between Poland and Lithuania, and it is 200 miles away from Russia. Its weird position makes it very important to Putin's expansionist plans because it's kind of like his octopus tentacle in the Baltic states. With a population of just over 1 million people, the oblast is not very big, and it covers an area of about 5,830 square miles, which is about 15,000 square kilometers. The region is just a fifth of Lithuania, but it is a bit of a mixed bag with a Polish, Lithuanian, and German-speaking population. You're probably wondering how Russia managed to get its hands on such a territory, and the story behind it is actually intriguing. Kaliningrad has been a part of Russia since the Soviet Union collapsed, but its past began in 1255 when the region was run by a German military order known as the Teutonic Knights. They named the little spot Königsberg, which means the King's Mountain, in honor of King Ottokar II. Its position on the Baltic Sea made it the perfect little trading spot, and in 1454 it became a part of Prussia, which was a vassal state for Poland. Reformation swept through the area, and in 1525 the Duke of Prussia secularized the territories in the area. Königsberg suffered a bit of an identity crisis during the 1600s as the Polish and Swedish fought for the land. But in 1701, Prussia sat back down in the driver's seat and made Königsberg the capital of Prussia. All these little states were sucked into one big empire known as the German Empire. The exact year for this was 1871, and from there Königsberg began to thrive as a cultural and economic center. Otto von Bismarck was the star of the show during the period of time until the First World War came around. During that time, Königsberg became a military base, and after the First World War, it became a Nazi party base. During the Second World War, the Allied powers struck the city heavily, because it was the strength of Germany at the time, and in April of 1945, the Soviet forces captured the city during the Battle of Königsberg. The Soviet Union's Red Army had been pushing into Eastern Europe and launching what it was calling the East Prussian Offensive. The battle started in January with 130,000 German troops defending the city, and it all came to an end in April of 1945 when the Soviet Union finally managed to overpower Germany and facilitate its surrender. With the new victory came a name change and an ownership shift. Königsberg became Kaliningrad in honor of a brave Soviet leader known as Mikhail Kalinin. From the ashes of Königsberg, Kaliningrad was rebuilt, and it became a Soviet naval base and industrial center. So it basically became just as great as Königsberg was, but it was now under different leadership. After the Soviet Union was dissolved, Kaliningrad did not share the same history as the other Baltic states that got the opportunity to run off and become independent. It remained a part of the Russian Federation, and in the 1990s there was some economic decline and population loss. This drop was only for a few years, and since the 2000s, Kaliningrad has been thriving as an economic center and a tourism area too. Kaliningrad has come a long way since then, and now that Russia has fortified it, the region is Putin's strategic playground. Let's talk a little about why Putin does not want to lose this land and why it is so important in his ambitions. Firstly, the oblast gives Russia access to the all-important Baltic Sea. This sea is a strategic treasure because it borders 9 countries: Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Germany, Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, and Sweden. A lot of shipping and trading happens on this border. So it's very important for Russia that it has a slice of this pie. As the only port that is ice-free all year round, Kaliningrad is the headquarters of the Russian Baltic Fleet, with 1,000 military personnel and 100 units of special military equipment. Russia has also begun to carry out rocket and artillery drills in this location in preparation for a war with NATO. The reason that Putin has built up his military presence for strategic deterrence on the Baltic Sea is because he has become very weary of the heavy United States naval presence in the waters. It may look like a US-Russia issue, but on a wider scale, the Baltic Sea is a contentious area between NATO and Moscow because a lot of Baltic states are part of the NATO alliance. In March of 1999, Poland entered NATO, and the other Baltic states followed shortly after in 2004. To make matters worse, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland all entered the European Union, which is another alliance that Putin despises. In recent years, Putin has been feeling suffocated by all these states, and because of that, he has fought hard to fortify Kaliningrad against them. Outside of being a naval base, Kaliningrad is also a nuclear house for the Kremlin. In Putin's numerous nuclear rants, he has often announced plans to station Iskander missiles in Kaliningrad to counter the US missile shield that has been developing in Eastern Europe. Washington had to try to explain that the shield has nothing to do with Putin, as it was actually meant to counter possible missile attacks by Iran, but Putin is convinced otherwise. This has led to a fear amongst the Baltic nations that in the event that the war with Ukraine turns nuclear, they could be hit with nukes as well. We also need to consider Kaliningrad's command of the Baltic Sea is not the only reason Putin holds it in high regard. This region is also in a strong position along the Suwalki Gap, which is a little corridor that has earned the interesting nickname of NATO's soft underbelly and the most dangerous place on Earth. It is a 62.14 mile, about 100 kilometer, piece of land that is in between Kaliningrad and Belarus. On top of being a little transport line, it is also a border between the NATO countries of Poland and Lithuania. Because of this, Russia is fighting hard to take over the strip of land so that it can cut off these Baltic states from NATO. Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former US Army Europe commander, recognizes the great advantage that Russia has in this regard, stating that Russia could take over the Baltic states faster than we would be able to defend them. All of these geographical pressures have existed since the late 1900s, but the tension between the two countries began to heat up in 2022 when Lithuania instituted a ban on goods subject to EU sanctions from passing through Kaliningrad. After Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the EU bloc began a form of economic warfare. Despite this blockade being the consequences of its actions, Russia was furious and stated that Lithuania was playing a Western puppet. Russia's anger here seems misplaced, considering the fact that everyone was imposing sanctions against Russia during the time. Lithuania responded, saying that it was merely upholding European Union sanctions. And the Lithuanian foreign minister responded to the accusation, stating, "It's not Lithuania doing anything. It's European sanctions that started working from 17th of June. It was done with consultation from the European Commission and under European Commission guidelines." This little fight worsened things between Moscow and the EU. And during a visit visit to Kaliningrad, Mr. Pastrusev, Putin's friend, stated that the blockade by Lithuania was instigated by the West in violation of international law. This same international law, the one that Putin ignores, is apparently supposed to protect Russia, too. Russia was so hot and bothered that it called the EU ambassador to the Russian Foreign Ministry over the blockade to try and air its grievances. As a threat, the Secretary of Russia's Security Council stated that appropriate measures would be taken in the near future. The near future came a little sooner than expected, when Russian hacker group Killnet claimed responsibility for a denial of service (DDoS) cyber attack on Lithuania, saying it was in response to the decision to block the transit of some sanctioned goods to the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad. A DDoS cyber attack is one that floods a server with traffic so that users cannot connect to the services the site offers. Lithuania's cybersecurity center stated that the attacks hit the transportation, energy, and financial sectors, and that they increased in intensity throughout the weeks. Russia was very happy to claim the attacks, and the group called Killnet released a statement boldly declaring their move. When the question came up of whether they had done it because of Lithuania's blockade, the group spokesperson said, yes. Killnet demolished over 1,652 web resources and stated that they would only lift their attack if Lithuania lifted the blockade. With tensions brewing since 2022, the war in Ukraine was enough to put the plans for war into motion. The question that is on Lithuania's mind right now is, who's next? Everyone knows that Putin is not just stopping at Ukraine, and so one of the Baltic nations is definitely next on the plan. According to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, what is happening in Ukraine is a wake-up call. Putin's aggression in Ukraine is proof that there are only a few years left to prepare, and NATO needs to gear up. Tomas Janelianas, a political scientist at Vilnius University, actually sees what is happening in Ukraine as a blessing in disguise. Because of what has happened on that side, Lithuania has time to prepare for an offensive. Unfortunately for Kaliningrad, whatever goodwill existed between it and Lithuania was completely destroyed by what Putin did in February of 2022. Darius, a Lithuanian who used to live in Lithuania's Panemun, just across the bridge from Kaliningrad's Sovetsk, recalled how, in the past, he even used to have a Russian friend when he was a kid. However, after the beginning of the war, Lithuanians have not wanted anything to do with Kaliningrad. Lithuania has been gearing up for war against Kaliningrad, but its real fight is with mainland Russia. Lithuania has a very complicated history with Russia, and it fought very hard to gain its sovereignty from it. Its intense preparation is because it never wants to find itself in the same place as it was all the way back in the time of the Romans and the Vikings. During this time, there was a small tribe from the area around Vilnius known as the Lithuanians, and it was worried about a rising threat that was coming from the east. To combat the threat, Lithuania and Poland formed a commonwealth in 1569, which successfully kept Russia at bay. Unfortunately, Poland began to Polonize Lithuania, and Polish culture became superior. The duo began to lose its strength in the 17th century, and after losing a couple of wars, it was partitioned and annexed by Prussia, Austria, and Russia, falling under Russian rule. From Russia, it fell under Nazi Germany and then went back to the Soviet Union. When the Soviets reoccupied it, the level of brutality it carried out against Lithuania was extreme. During Russia's occupation of Lithuania, it introduced a program of Russification and attempted to eliminate the Lithuanian language and culture in favor of Russian culture. During this time, in the mid-19th century, thousands of people were murdered, tortured, and expelled to Siberia in cattle carriages. After spending all these years suppressed, Lithuania started gearing up to take back control in the 1940s when its guerrilla resistance began. Momentum picked up in 1988 when a group called the Sąjūdis, which was made up of 500 intellectuals and young Communist Party officials, started a movement. After much protesting, the momentous day came on the 11th of March 1990, when Lithuania became the first Soviet-controlled state to restore its independence. Though the initial hit was brutal, the Soviet Union refused to go down that easy, and it conducted 3 attack phases before it gave in. At first, Soviet troops were ordered to take youths and deserters forcibly after Lithuania refused to agree to Soviet conscription as a way of quenching the spirit of the revolution. In the second phase of the attack, the USSR troops strengthened their position on the borders and began confiscating all firearms from Lithuanians. As if that was not enough, they also took control of buildings and institutions that belonged to the Communist Party and the Economic Front. The USSR implemented a blockade of goods, including oil and gas supplies, to Lithuania for 10 weeks. Still, Lithuania stood by its decision, and eventually the USSR had to concede. As if that was not enough bad karma, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and all of the other Baltic states also got the opportunity to break away. After such a complex and traumatic history, it is undeniable that Lithuania has deep economic, psychological, and spiritual scars. The recent moves by Putin in Ukraine have triggered a fear that it had long been suppressing, and that is what has led us to today, day as Lithuania gears up for war. No time has been wasted, and already Lithuania's defense ministry, together with the armed forces, have already begun to install what they are calling permanent counter-mobility measures. The installation of these measures has been strategic, and the starting point has been the bridge separating Panomun from Sovetsk so that Lithuania can stop the movement of hostile vehicles. Defense Minister Kasčiūnas has stated that the Lithuanian government is looking to spend about $653 million on this project over the next decade, and plans are in place to boost its defense budget to spend nearly 3% of GDP. A large portion of the money is going to go to mines that are already on their way to Lithuania as we speak. These mines are specifically anti-tank land mines, some that are horizontal action mines and others that are bottom mines. On top of the land mines, naval mines are also being acquired to launch attacks against Russia's Baltic fleet, and to fast-track mine development and make it cheaper, the Defense Ministry is also discussing the possibility of Lithuanian companies producing them. Kasčiūnas also revealed a fortification plan that involved placing permanent border fortifications at 2 locations in September, and opening the first counter-mobility park at the end of August. A total of 27 counter-mobility parks are supposed to be constructed, and Lithuania is looking to establish them on a weekly basis. These counter-mobility parks are going to have 4 types of fortifications. The first one is going to be the Dragon's Teeth. These obstacles are large, triangular-shaped blocks that are placed in rows and patterns. What they do is block vehicle movement and delay enemy advances, giving troops time to advance and attack. These anti-tank barriers were used in the Second World War, particularly on the Eastern Front. But as the saying goes, if it's not broken, don't fix it. The next fortification are the Hedgehogs, which can be used to stop traffic and Spanish riders and common roadblocks that serve the same function. Some of these counter-mobility parks will be near the border and will serve as the initial line of defense. The Queen Louis Bridge, which is between the Kaliningrad Oblast and Lithuania, will also be lined with 80 dragon teeth and 7 hedgehogs, and these will be further fortified by concertina wires. In terms of spending, on top of the $648 million, about $864 million will be allocated to the armed forces, and $2.6 million for the purchase of counter-mobility engineering equipment this year. Defense Minister Kasčiūnas explained that no stone would be left unturned, stating that not only will we create bases where to base the fortifications, but we will fortify some areas permanently and immediately at the end of the summer. For example, there is a bridge that is not in use, but an enemy could potentially drive over it, so we will fortify it. Another feature that Lithuania will be taking advantage of is the Second World War-era bunkers all over the country's border with Kaliningrad. The Red Army constructed these bunkers along the Molotov line that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Seas. There are around 300 of them in Lithuania, and although the Soviet Union did not manage to construct them in time, they were well laid out. Some of these bunkers are right in the middle of the Suwalki Gap, which is the prime strip of land we spoke about earlier that connects the Baltics with the other side. These bunkers need a little bit of sprucing up, but they could be used as fighting positions or as shelters for civilians. Lithuania is looking to refurbish these bunkers as a part of the infrastructure for its military personnel. Outside of the government, even the residents of Lithuania are calmly preparing for the war with Kaliningrad. Vystiesis, which is a small town in the southwestern of Lithuania, may seem calm, but there are preparations underway. This town is so close to Russia that its residents can see Russian border guards on the other side from their homes. And Irina Skuskis, a factory worker, told Al Jazeera, "We take a swim in the lake just 10 or so meters from the barbed wire fence. Sometimes we can hear the border guards on the Russian side playing music. When that happens, we have a barbecue and dance to the music that's coming from the tower." Despite how relaxed these residents seem, the increased military presence gives it away, with residents stating that it is normal to see armored vehicles going by regularly. On top of that, the number of people joining the army and volunteer militias like the Lithuanian Riflemen has spiked, with everyone eager to be a part of keeping Russia out. According to the residents, there are thousands more requests to join the volunteer militia being made this year, and according to one volunteer, there is a waiting list of 2.5 years. To see how the residents are preparing, let's take a look at Jonas and Vida Sukditis. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, I apologize to that family. Standing inside their underground shelter with their emergency food stock. Because of the history of bombing and the future of war, bomb shelters like this one are being built by many Lithuanian residents. You may be able to explain away this type of preparation as just caution, but what must we make of German troops being deployed to Lithuania? In April of this year, about 24 German soldiers arrived in Lithuania, laying the groundwork for a further 150 to join them later this year. By the end of 2027, the goal is to have 5,000 soldiers in Lithuania. These troops are going to be permanently stationed in Lithuania and become part of Germany's Lithuanian Brigade. The aim is to prepare for the triggering of Article 5 of the NATO alliance. Such a bold move could also work as a deterrent against an army looking to step in. According to German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, the world is completely different from where it was before February of 2022. Both Germany and Lithuania recognize that the national defense is not enough, and alliances will have to be utilized to fight Russia. The fortification plan is the defense element of Lithuania's plan, but this military collaboration is a part of Lithuania's more aggressive strategy against Kaliningrad. We keep talking about the war as one between Lithuania and Russia, but what are the sentiments in Kaliningrad? Although it is a part of Russia, the region has its own identity and relations. Prior to the invasion of Ukraine, Kaliningrad and Ukraine had a relatively decent relationship. In fact, for a couple of years, there had been talks about Kaliningrad becoming a fourth Baltic state. Although Kaliningrad is a part of Russia, Europe's attitudes toward it is different. The region is considered a special economic zone, and it has been a zone for a lot of investment. Because of this, it has earned itself the nickname the Baltic Hong Kong, and many foreign investors have helped find urban renewal and reconstruction projects. The region has also become a great tourist spot, with the creation of local history museums, transforming the birthplace of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant into an emerging tourist destination. Turning Kaliningrad into a tourist destination has had the effect of disassociating it from Russia and giving it its own harmless feel. While the rest of Russia does not get to travel around Europe as freely, 82% of Kaliningraders had passports for foreign travel. Things have not always been good between the Kremlin and Kaliningrad, and between 2009 and 2010, there were rampant anti-government protests. To quiet the uprising, Moscow had to dispatch a special envoy, and the heavy military presence that exists in Kaliningrad is actually to be able to control these masses. Kaliningrad does not benefit in any way from the war in Ukraine, and for the most part, it has tried to stay out of the mess that Putin has made. Unfortunately, by virtue of being a part of Russia, it is going to be the grounds of the war between Moscow and Lithuania. Lithuania is not the only state in the Baltics that is preparing for war with Russia. With a fear of turning out just like Ukraine, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia agreed at the beginning of 2024 to set up a common Baltic defense zone on their borders with Russia and Belarus. The defense minister of all three Baltic countries met in January and began to approve plans for the construction of anti-mobility defense installations on their eastern frontiers. The three nations have also agreed to develop missile artillery cooperation and allow them to share their arsenal a lot easier in the case of a war. Estonian Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur focused a lot on the importance of bunkers at the border, stating that it was just as important to prepare to be on the defensive as it was to rally troops up. Estonia is looking to build 600 bunkers along its 183-mile, but 294-kilometer border with Russia, with construction expected to begin as early as 2025. The budget was about $65 million, and each bunker will be able to house 10 soldiers. Estonia and Latvia have also signed a cooperation agreement, in which both nations will be conducting NATO air policing from Latvia's Lietuvade airbase, as Estonia's Amari airbase is currently down due to repairs. The countries have also ramped up their defense spending, with Estonia spending 3.43% of its GDP and Latvia spending 3.15%, the second and fourth highest defense spending totals in NATO on a per-GDP basis. Just like Lithuania, Latvia has a multinational battalion led by Canada that is not stationed permanently like the German one, but that is ready to be deployed as soon as it is needed. An increase in the military budget is always the first sign that a war is on the horizon. Lithuania has set aside a lot of money to bump up its defenses, along with plans for fortification along its border with Kaliningrad. The bridge joining these two areas is also a part of the region being heavily fortified, and the Suwalki Gap is also not being spared. Lithuania will also be relying on its allies and Article 5 of NATO in the case of war. Currently, Putin has his hands full with Ukraine, but if things continue to escalate, the war could be moving down to the Baltics.
The greatest threat to Russia isn't NATO. It's not economic sanctions, and it's not even the war in Ukraine. It's something much quieter but far more dangerous: Russia's own population collapse. Surprising as it may seem, the Russian government has known about this problem for decades. They've tried all sorts of strategies to turn things around, but none have really made a difference. Back in 2006, Vladimir Putin himself called the demographic crisis Russia's most urgent issue, and even urged Russian women to have more children and focus on starting families. But fast forward 20 years later, and despite those efforts, little has changed, except that the situation has only gotten worse. In this video, we're going to take a look at Russia's demographic crisis. We'll break down what's happening, why it's happening, and what it could mean for Russia's future. From the plummeting birth rates and mass immigration to the effects of the ongoing war, we'll explore why this challenge might be Russia's toughest yet, one with consequences that could reach far beyond its borders. And believe it or not, alcohol, particularly vodka, might be playing a bigger role in Russia's decline than you think. We'll dig into that in a minute, but first, let's look at where things stand today. Before that, be sure to hit the like button below. Any video criticizing Putin has a chance of getting downvoted by Putin's bots to kill its reach in the algorithm, so you can help us fight that. Let's begin. Right now, Russia's fertility rate is hovering around 1.5 births per woman. To put that into perspective, a stable population needs a fertility rate of about 2.1. 2 births to replace mom and dad, and the extra 0.1% is crucial because it accounts for those who might not make it to adulthood. Anything below this number means that over time, a country's population starts shrinking, and for Russia, that's exactly what's happening. A declining population means fewer people entering the workforce. As fewer children are born each year, the number of young people entering the job market begins to decline. This isn't just a problem for businesses looking to hire, but it's also a systematic issue that affects the entire economy. With fewer working-age people, the pressure on those still in the workforce grows significantly. They're not only supporting themselves, but also an increasing number of retirees who depend on pensions and healthcare services. As the population ages and more people leave the workforce, the strain on those social support systems only gets heavier. A shrinking workforce means fewer taxpayers, which translates to less revenue flowing into the government's coffers. This becomes a major problem when it comes to funding essential services like pensions, healthcare, and education. When the government struggles to maintain these programs, people start to feel more financially insecure, and that insecurity often has a direct effect on birth rates. When the future feels uncertain, jobs are hard to come by, wages aren't growing, and living costs keep climbing, people tend to postpone starting families or decide to have fewer kids. It creates a vicious cycle where economic stress and low birth rates feed into each other, making the situation even harder to fix. This demographic problem becomes even more striking when you think about how big the country is. Russia's absolutely massive, stretching over 17 million square kilometers, making it the biggest country in the world. It covers 11 different time zones, reaching from Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. To give you an idea of how huge it is, you could take the entire United States or China, fit them within Russia's borders, and there would still be room to spare, almost half of the space left over. Yet, despite its massive size, Russia's population is only about 143 million people as of 2024. Now, 143 million might sound like a lot, but once you start comparing, you realize just how small that number really is. Take Bangladesh, for example. It's a country that's over 116 times smaller than Russia, but it's packed with more than 170 million people. That means that Bangladesh has almost 30 million more people than Russia, squeezed into a much smaller space. And it's not just Bangladesh. Look at Japan, 125 million people living in 377,000 square kilometers. Russia's about 45 times bigger than Japan in terms of land area, yet Japan's population is not that far behind. So even though Russia is a massive country, it doesn't have a massive population to match. These are just 2 examples, and there are many more. At least now you know just how unique and challenging Russia's demographic situation is. Just think about Siberia and the Russian Far East. Combined, these regions cover over 10 million square kilometers, which is more than the entire land area of the United States. Yet the whole Far Eastern Federal District has fewer than 8 million residents. That's less than a city like New York or London. Now, you might wonder why these regions are so empty. Well, a big reason is that after the Soviet Union fell apart in the 1990s, the government couldn't keep supporting these far-flung regions the way they used to. Back in the Soviet days, there was this big push to develop Siberia and the Russian Far East. They sent miners, industrial workers, and their families out there with promises of jobs and decent living standards. Places like Chukotka, Matagan, and Kamchatka were buzzing with activity. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the funding. The industries were shut down, and the people who had moved east started to head back west. They packed up and left for Moscow, St. Petersburg, or just left Russia altogether, looking for better opportunities. As a result, a lot of these towns have been left practically deserted. Some of them are now on the brink of becoming ghost towns. It's kind of like those old Wild West towns in the US that thrived during a gold rush and then just disappeared when the gold dried up. But in Russia, it's on a much bigger scale. Take Norilsk, for example, one of the largest cities in the Arctic. It's way up in northern Siberia and is known for being a big player in nickel mining. The city is still economically important, but its population has completely flatlined. The younger generation isn't sticking around anymore. Instead, they're leaving for places like Moscow, where they think there's more opportunity and a better quality of life. And honestly, who can blame them? Living in a remote, freezing place like Norilsk isn't exactly everyone's dream. This same story repeats in Khabarovsk and Vladivostok, further down in the Russian Far East. These places have history, culture, and natural beauty, but the younger folks often leave. They head off to European Russia, where things are a bit more connected and modern, or they even leave the country entirely, seeking better prospects abroad. And here's the thing. It's not just about personal choices or economic reasons. It's also about the impact this has on the country as a whole. When people leave these remote regions, it makes it harder for Russia to maintain its presence and influence in those areas. Places like Siberia and the Russian Far East are incredibly rich in natural resources like oil, gas, minerals, you name it. But with fewer people living there, it becomes tougher to develop these areas and keep the local economy going. On top of that, the harsh climate of these regions plays a huge role too. It's tough to convince people to live in a place where winters last most of the year and the nearest major city is 1,000 kilometers away. Without enough people, it's hard for these areas to develop the infrastructure they need, like schools, hospitals, and modern amenities. It creates a vicious cycle. People leave because life is tough, and life stays tough because there aren't enough people. But if we look at the other end of the spectrum, Moscow tells a different story. While much of Russia's hinterlands struggle with depopulation, Moscow is growing. It's now home to over 13 million people, with the wider metropolitan area reaching nearly 21.5 million. This makes Moscow not only the largest city in Russia, but also one of the largest in Europe. St. Petersburg has also seen growth, though on a smaller scale, rising from 4.7 million in 2002 to about 5.6 million today. So when you put all this together, you can start to see why Russia's demographic issue is such a big deal. The country has this enormous amount of land, but it's struggling to keep its population spread out across it. Sure, Moscow and St. Petersburg are bustling hubs with millions of residents, but the farther you go from these cities, the emptier things get. And in a country like Russia, that can have serious implications, not just for the economy, but for things like national security and regional stability too. But how did it get this bad? To really understand this, we have to go back in time, way back, to the early days of the 20th century. The roots of Russia's demographic issues run deep, all the way through revolutions, Stalin's brutal purges, and the devastating patriotic war that left a lasting impact on the population. You see, it all started with the revolutions of the early 1900s. The Russian Empire, which had ruled for centuries, came crashing down in 1917 during the Russian Revolution. That year, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, overthrew the monarchy and established the Soviet Union. But the transition wasn't smooth, far from it. The Bolshevik takeover plunged the country into a brutal civil war that would last from 1917 to 1923, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against the anti-Bolshevik White Army, which included various factions, monarchists, and foreign intervention forces. This conflict was not confined to battlefields. It swept through cities, towns, and rural areas, tearing apart the social fabric of the country. The Russian Civil War resulted in millions of deaths. Estimates vary, but it's believed that between 7 to 12 million people died due to combat, famine, and disease. The fighting itself claimed the lives of around 2 to 3 million. Entire towns were caught in the crossfire, and atrocities were committed on both sides, leading to a level of brutality that devastated the civilian population. But perhaps even more destructive than the fighting was the famine that struck during this period. With the chaos of war, agriculture production collapsed. Farmers were often caught between the Red and White armies, and their crops and livestock were seized or destroyed. The resulting food shortages led to widespread famine. It's estimated that around 5 million people died of starvation, with entire villages succumbing to hunger. Regions like the Volga Basin and Ukraine were hit particularly hard, with people resorting to eating whatever they could find, like roots and grass. On top of that, epidemics of typhus, cholera, and influenza swept through the population, taking advantage of malnutrition and poor living conditions. The population of the Russian Empire was around 170 million before World War I, but by the end of the Civil War, it had dropped significantly, with estimates suggesting a loss of around 10 to 12 million people in just a few short years. This loss was not just a matter of numbers. It meant that entire generations were decimated, leaving behind a population that was physically weakened. The Civil War also caused mass displacement. As battles raged across the country, millions of people fled their homes, either to escape the fighting or to search for food and safety. Many fled to neighboring countries, creating a massive refugee crisis in Eastern Europe. Some never returned, leaving behind ghost towns and abandoned farms. Families were separated, with children often left orphaned and communities shattered. The displacement didn't just mean that people were moving. It meant that entire communities were being uprooted and destroyed, taking with them the cultural and social ties that had held them together for generations. The loss of millions of people, especially young men, during the Civil War and the associated crises meant that the birth rate took a hit. Beyond the obvious losses of life and displacement, there was a psychological toll that affected the survivors. The trauma of witnessing family members die, of facing starvation, and of seeing one's home destroyed left many with a sense of disillusionment and bitterness. This collective trauma would shape Soviet society in the years that followed, creating a population that was both resilient and scarred by the hardships they'd endured. But the story didn't end there. After the Civil War, the Soviet Union was born, and a new chapter began. The Soviet government, once it had secured power, made efforts to rebuild and reshape the country, but the demographic imbalance was hard to ignore. Joseph Stalin believed that for the Soviet Union to survive and compete with Western powers, it needed to industrialize rapidly. He saw industrialization not just as a path to economic strength, but as a way to cement his control over the country. To achieve this, he launched a series of aggressive policies that included the 5-year plans, beginning in 1928. These plans aimed to speed up the development of heavy industries like steel production, coal mining, and machinery. To fuel this industrial push, the Soviet Union needed resources, manpower, and, crucially, food to support its growing urban workforce. And that's where collectivization came in, a policy that would change the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, especially those in rural areas. Collectivization meant taking away privately owned farms and consolidating them into large state-run collective farms, known as kolkhozes or sovkhozes. The Soviet government argued that this would modernize agriculture, increase food production, and free up labor for factories. But in practice, it was a brutal process that met with widespread resistance. Many farmers, or kulaks as the Soviet propaganda labeled them, didn't want to give up their land, their way of life, or the small measure of independence they'd managed to hold on to. In response, Stalin's regime came down hard. Those who resisted were labeled as enemies of the state and faced harsh punishments. Entire families were branded as kulaks and sent to the Gulag, Soviet prison camps scattered across the remote and freezing reaches of Siberia, the Urals, and Kazakhstan. These camps were notorious for their brutal conditions. Prisoners were forced into hard labor in extreme climates, building railways, mining, or logging, with barely enough food to survive. The death toll in the gulags was staggering. It's estimated that between 1.5 to 2 million people died in these camps during the 1930s alone, succumbing to starvation, disease, and exhaustion. But it wasn't just those sent to the Gulag who suffered. The process of collectivization itself unleashed chaos across the Soviet countryside. Farmers who had their land and livestock seized faced the prospect of starvation. Livestock numbers plummeted as desperate peasants slaughtered their animals rather than handing them over to the state. The agricultural disruption caused by this mass upheaval led to severe food shortages, and what followed was one of the darkest chapters in Soviet history, the Holodomor. The Holodomor, which means death by hunger in Ukrainian, took place from 1932 to 1933. It was a man-made famine, driven by Stalin's policies and the forced requisition of grain from the Ukrainian countryside. The Soviet government took the food that Ukrainian farmers produced, often leaving them with nothing to eat. The grain was sold abroad to fund industrial projects, while millions of people back home starved. Estimates suggest that around 3.5 to 7 million people died during the Holodomor. Entire villages were wiped out, and the scenes of suffering were unimaginable. Again, people resorted to eating grass and leaves, and some even resorted to cannibalism in their desperation. The demographic impact of Stalin's policies during this time is hard to overstate. Estimates indicate that the rural birth rate dropped by more than 50% during the peak of the famine. In some areas, it fell to as low as 15 to 20 births per 1,000 people. Families struggling to survive simply couldn't afford to have more children. Communities that had once been tight-knit and self-sufficient were fractured. Their cultural traditions disrupted as people were moved to collective farms or deported to distant regions. The shift of labor from the countryside to the city may have fueled industrial growth, but it left a hollowed-out countryside behind. The forced industrialization did achieve some of its goals. By the late 1930s, the Soviet Union had built up a significant industrial base. The country was producing more steel, oil, and machinery than ever before, and Stalin boasted that the USSR had caught up with the West. But these achievements came at a terrible cost. The millions who died of starvation, the families torn apart by the Gulag, and the villages that vanished from the map left deep demographic holes that couldn't easily be filled. And then came the purges. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed what's known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. During this time, he targeted anyone he considered a threat to his power: political rivals, intellectuals, military officers, and even ordinary citizens. Hundreds of thousands were executed, and millions more were imprisoned in the gulags. But as devastating as the purges were, the most severe blow to Russia's population came during World War II. For Russia, this wasn't just World War II, it was the Great Patriotic War. According to Russians, the Great Patriotic War began on June 22, 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. The Nazis aimed to conquer the Soviet Union quickly, believing that a swift victory would crush the Soviet regime. But the Soviet Union was determined to fight back, and what followed was a brutal 4-year struggle for survival that engulfed nearly every part of the country. For the Soviet people, this wasn't just a war, it was a fight for their homes, their families, and their very existence. More than 1,700 towns and some 70,000 villages had been all but wiped off the map, along with around 32,000 factories and 65,000 kilometers of railway track. Plus, the human toll of this war was unimaginable. By the time it ended in 1945, over 27 million Soviet citizens had lost their lives. This staggering number includes roughly 8 to 11 million soldiers who fought in some of the war's most brutal battles, like Stalingrad and Kursk. But the devastation didn't stop with the military losses. Millions of Soviet civilians were also caught in the crossfire or directly targeted by Nazi forces. Entire towns and villages were erased from the map, and cities turned into war zones. For many, the war was nothing short of a living nightmare. Reports suggest that around 18.5 million Soviet citizens died throughout World War II. To put this into perspective, the United States suffered about 300,000 combat deaths and 400,000 total deaths during the war. This means that the Soviet Union endured 67 times as many losses as the United States in World War II. One of the most harrowing chapters of World War II was the Siege of Leningrad, a city that endured nearly 900 days of relentless bombardment and blockade by Nazi forces. From September 1941 to January 1944, Leningrad was cut off from supplies and surrounded by German troops who sought to starve the city into submission. With supply lines severed, food in Leningrad became a rare and precious commodity. Rations plummeted to just 125 grams of bread per person per day during the worst periods of the siege, and even then, the bread was often mixed with sawdust to make it last longer. The desperation drove people to extreme measures, like boiling leather belts, shoes, and even wallpaper paste in a desperate attempt to extract any bit of nutrition they could. The war left a profound mark on Russia's demographics. In fact, if you look at the population pyramid of the Russian Federation today, you can still see the echo of World War II moving through their society. A population pyramid typically reflects the distribution of different age groups in a society. In healthy growing populations, it resembles a true pyramid. Growing populations have more youth at the bottom than aging people at the top. Stable populations look like pillars. Russia's pyramid looks like a choppy and uneven wave. That's because every 30 years, the generation connected to World War II produces far fewer people than the generations around them. More than 27 million Soviet citizens lost their lives during the war, people who might have married, had children, and kept the cycle of life going. Instead, many of them died on the front lines, in sieges, or under Nazi occupation. With so many lives lost, there simply weren't enough people left to start new families once the war was over. This drop in birth rates didn't just disappear, it left a lasting mark on Russia's demographics. It's like a ripple effect that stretches across time. Every 30 years or so, the impact of those losses resurfaces as each smaller generation leads to another, continuing the cycle of population decline. World War II killed roughly 14% of the Russian population. Unless the couples in the generations connected to World War II decided to have 4 to 6 children each, there was no way for the Soviet Union to correct the loss that was suffered between 1941 and 1945. Unfortunately, the trauma of the war left many survivors focused on simply trying to rebuild their lives, with little energy left for starting families. It's hard to think about starting a family when you're surrounded by the physical reminders of war. Ruined buildings, mass graves, and vast empty spaces where whole villages once stood. For many, the focus was on putting one foot in front of the other, not on raising children. Despite all this, Stalin pushed forward with rebuilding efforts, demanding even more sacrifices from the population. The Soviet government poured resources into reconstruction, but the process took years. By the 1950s, there was a brief moment of hope with a baby boom. The Soviet Union's total population grew from about 170 million in 1946 to roughly 200 million by 1956. This growth reflected the high birth rates, with around 2.5 to 3 million births each year in the early 1950s. The Soviet government actively encouraged families to have more children, trying to rebuild from the devastation of the war. But even with this surge, they could never fully replace the millions of lives lost between 1941 and 1945. The psychological impact of the war made many hesitant to have large families. After all, they'd seen firsthand how fragile life could be. Fast forward to the 1970s and 1980s, and the Soviet Union was starting to stagnate. The initial optimism of the post-war years started to fade, and the economy began to struggle. Factories built during the era of rapid industrialization became outdated, and the planned economy couldn't keep up with the needs of a modern society. The healthcare system, which had once been a point of pride, started to crumble under the weight of these challenges. Infant mortality rates rose, and life expectancy began to decline. The population, which had grown briefly in the post-war years, now faced new pressures and started dropping again. Then came the 1980s, and with it a new crisis: alcoholism. Vodka was not only cheap and easily accessible, but it was also ingrained in the very fabric of Russian society. The combination of economic struggles and the cultural normalization of heavy drinking caused alcohol consumption to soar, leading to a staggering rise in alcohol-related illnesses and deaths. This directly contributed to the country's worsening demographic decline. Men in particular were hit hard, with skyrocketing rates of alcohol-related diseases like cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning. In some regions, men's life expectancy plummeted to shockingly low levels, with many dying in their 50s or even earlier. By the late 1980s, the average life expectancy for men in Russia had dropped to just 63 years, a decline that paralleled the rise in alcohol consumption. To put this into perspective, in certain parts of the Soviet Union, men were dying at rates typically seen in war zones, not in peacetime nations. In regions like the Russian Far East and Siberia, male life expectancy sank even further, as low as the mid-50s. But to be fair, this wasn't a new problem. Russians had been drinking themselves into early graves long before the Soviet Union existed, going back as far as the days of the ancient Tsars. For centuries, alcohol had been the most common escape for the average Russian citizen, a way to numb the pain of harsh winters, political oppression, and economic instability. During the Soviet era, alcohol was often used as a coping mechanism to endure the grinding realities of life under the regime. Even today, the situation in Russia remains grim. Sure, there's a war going on, but outside of that, there's plenty of food, no widespread famine, and none of the extreme hardships you might expect from a failed state. Yet despite this, the average teenage boy in Russia today still has a lower chance of living to the age of 65 than boys in some of the world's poorest and most war-torn countries, like Somalia or Ethiopia. Even in 2021, before the war, the life expectancy for Russian men was just 67 years, still shockingly low by global standards. So the only difference is that the Russian population has vodka. It might surprise you to learn that, on average, Russians consume a staggering 18 liters of pure alcohol per person each year. To put that into context, that's more than double the maximum amount deemed safe by the World Health Organization, which recommends no more than 8 liters per year. Excessive drinking in Russia has remained one of the country's biggest killers, contributing to as much as 30% of all deaths in the country. Even in times of relative peace and economic stability, Russia's deep-rooted alcohol problem remains one of the biggest factors driving its demographic crisis. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not a new issue. Alcohol has plagued Russian society since the mid-16th century, ever since Ivan the Terrible legalized the sale of vodka as a state-controlled enterprise to raise revenue. From then on, vodka's fueled countless personal tragedies and, on a larger scale, contributed to the decline of an entire nation. From church ceremonies and religious festivals to weddings, political functions, and even business transactions, vodka was the beverage of choice. It was customary, expected, and in many cases, seen as almost obligatory. No significant gathering in Russian society was complete without the clinking of glasses and the familiar burn of vodka. It wasn't just a social lubricant, but also widely believed to possess medicinal qualities. In fact, many Russians used vodka as an antiseptic, an anesthetic, and a treatment for various ailments. If a family member fell ill, a shot of vodka was seen as the remedy. If there was a cause for celebration, vodka was the first thing poured. Church events in particular played a significant role in the ritualized consumption of vodka. It was common at baptisms, funerals, and other religious ceremonies, further embedding alcohol into the cultural and spiritual life of Russians. The church's acceptance of vodka at these events only strengthened its position in society, making it an ever-present element of Russian life. In many ways, vodka wasn't just a drink. It was a tradition, a solution to both sorrow and joy, and a tool for social bonding. Soon, the Russian Tsars recognized the cultural importance of vodka and established a sophisticated system to heavily capitalize. So, over the course of 400 years, they not only controlled the entire vodka market, but also used it as a major source of revenue. By regulating production and distribution, they determined the price of vodka, and in doing so, ensured it was cheap and widely available. The Tsars knew that keeping the population supplied with an endless flow of inexpensive vodka was a means of control. The system established by the Tsars over the course of the next 400 years did more than just foster a cultural dependence on vodka. It became a sophisticated revenue-generating machine. The state controlled the entire vodka market, dictating production and setting prices, ensuring that vodka was not only cheap, but also widely available to the masses. The idea was simple. By keeping the population drunk on a constant supply of cheap vodka, the Tsars maintained control over the people. Vodka was, in many ways, a tool of governance. This tactic was particularly effective among the peasants, who often spent what little money they had on vodka. After a few drinks, they were too drunk to think critically about their dire circumstances, too drunk to question why he was living in poverty or how he might improve his lot in life, too drunk to organize or participate in any kind of protest or rebellion. The Tsarist regime understood that a population numbed by alcohol was far less likely to challenge their rule. And so, the vodka monopoly became a cornerstone of the Russian state's control over its citizens. Social events, especially in rural areas, were marked by marathon drinking sessions that often lasted for days. Peasants would attend communal parties, weddings, and religious festivals that seemed never-ending, and with each passing hour came more rounds of vodka. Weddings in particular became notorious for the sheer volume of alcohol consumed. The bride and groom would typically provide 6 to 8 vedros of vodka. That's around 75 to 100 liters, all of which would be consumed before the wedding ceremony even began. At the wedding itself, the bride's family could easily spend up to 200 rubles on vodka alone. To put that in perspective, this was an enormous sum of money, especially for a peasant family. For a poorer family, it could represent months or even an entire year's worth of savings, all spent in one go. This excessive spending on vodka at social gatherings wasn't seen as reckless, but rather it was expected. A social obligation to show respect and ensure the event was properly celebrated. The fact that families would willingly go into debt to provide such quantities of vodka shows just how integral the drink was to Russian peasant life. Vodka also played a major role in countless social and religious events. It's estimated that Orthodox feast days claimed more than 1/3 of the year. That's over 120 days devoted to religious observance, and, of course, drinking. As if that weren't enough, they found even more reasons to drink on non-religious occasions. Take, for example, the concept of pomoch. In Russian, pomoch means help, and it referred to one of the major social events in rural Russia, particularly in the countryside. Whenever a peasant found themselves needing extra hands for any kind of task, whether it was harvesting crops, building a barn, or even household chores, they would call for a pomoch. Essentially, this was a work party where friends, families, and neighbors would come together to lend a hand. But here's where things take a strange turn. The workers weren't paid with money. Instead, it was tradition for the host family to pay their helpers in food, and more importantly, vodka. And it wasn't just a small gesture. Providing vodka was considered a key part of hospitality. Before long, these gatherings shifted from being about getting the work done to being more about the drinking itself. Work that could have been completed in a day or two would stretch out for several as the workers became too intoxicated to continue after the first few hours. Instead of helping the community, these events often left people with little to show for their efforts, other than a headache and an empty bottle. So people began to turn to the village youth for help, but that quickly backfired. The Pomosh, which was supposed to be about working together, soon became the young people's first introduction to drinking. Even among the youth, the line between work and drinking began to blur, and what started as a tradition of helping out became more of an excuse to indulge in heavy drinking. It's easy to see how the Russian peasantry, and by extension the local economy, was digging its own grave through alcoholism. But the problem didn't stop there. This culture of excessive drinking soon seeped into the national economy as well, especially when alcohol made its way into the workplace. Just as the Pomosh tradition encouraged communal drinking in rural areas, there was another term in Russian workplaces, privalno. This was a welcoming ceremony for a new worker joining the team, and as you might guess, it involved vodka, along with some snacks. It wasn't just a casual party to break the ice, but it was an essential part of the onboarding process that solidified the bond between the worker and his colleagues. New hires were expected to drink on their very first day, even while receiving important instructions about their role. It wasn't uncommon for new employees to be so intoxicated that they hardly remembered the tasks they were supposed to learn. This practice turned what should have been a productive and informative first day into a chaotic and unprofessional mess. And it didn't just stop at the first day. Over time, this ceremony evolved into an unwritten rule in many Russian workplaces. Newly hired or newly promoted workers were expected to treat their colleagues to drinks and snacks. If they refused, they risked more than just a bad first impression. They might never acquire the skills they needed to do their job. You see, this wasn't just about drinking, it was about fitting in. If a new worker didn't provide the customary drinks, there was a good chance that his coworkers could intentionally withhold training or support. In some cases, the new hire could be ostracized completely, facing ridicule, name-calling, or even social isolation. It was in the worker's best interest to comply with this tradition, or risk being shut out by his peers. This ritual wasn't just a minor expenditure either. For many workers, it was a serious financial burden. The cost of treating fellow workers to vodka and snacks could range from 200 to 300 rubles, equivalent to several days' wages. And in some cases, workers were forced to spend as much as 800 rubles on a single drinking session. Imagine sacrificing a week's worth of pay just to buy alcohol for your colleagues. The impact of this tradition on the workforce was devastating. For a nation already struggling with productivity and industrial output, the widespread drinking in workplaces led to frequent accidents, injuries, and even fires. Factories in particular became hotspots for alcohol-fueled disasters. Workers who were intoxicated on the job were more prone to mistakes, mishandling equipment, or ignoring safety protocols. This led to frequent accidents, some of which were fatal. So naturally, the culture of drinking led to a general reduction in productivity across many sectors. Workers simply couldn't perform at their best while under the influence, and this had a direct impact on the efficiency of the national economy. By the 1920s, when the communists took control of Russia, the new regime quickly realized that the country's rampant alcohol problem was having a disastrous effect on productivity. The Soviet leadership decided that something had to be done about it. They understood that the country couldn't afford to have its labor force bogged down by drunkenness, especially as they embarked on a massive industrialization campaign. To address this, the Soviet government instituted strict measures to curb alcohol consumption in the workplace. One of their main strategies was to place guards at factory entrances. These guards were tasked with preventing workers from bringing alcohol into the workplace and ensuring that laborers showed up sober. On paper, this seemed like a reasonable solution. After all, a disciplined and sober workforce was critical for achieving the Soviets' ambitious industrial goals. However, in practice, these measures were far less effective than the regime had hoped. While some workers did modify their drinking habits, the deeply ingrained tradition of consuming vodka was hard to break. Laborers found creative ways to sneak alcohol into the factory, often hiding it in personal belongings or stashing bottles in various nooks and crannies around the workplace. Despite the presence of guards, vodka still made its way into the very spaces the government sought to keep alcohol free. The inefficacy of these measures highlighted how deeply entrenched alcohol was in Russian culture, even in the face of strict governmental control. It eventually became a cat-and-mouse game, with workers finding new ways to outwit the guards and continue their drinking traditions. Before the Communist Revolution, hiring practices were largely informal and based on personal connections. Workers were often hired upon the recommendation of an acquaintance, and this came with its own set of unwritten obligations. The newcomer was expected to throw a vodka party for his fellow workers as a way of clearing his debt for being introduced to the job. This created a cycle where new employees had to start their working lives by spending their hard-earned wages on alcohol for their colleagues. However, when the communists came to power, they reformed these hiring practices. The new government believed in a more meritocratic system, where workers were selected based on their skills and qualifications rather than personal connections. They eliminated the expectation that a new worker had to throw a party to repay those who recommended them. Additionally, the Soviets established trade schools run by trade unions, where new workers could receive formal training before entering the workforce. This eliminated the need for veteran workers to train new recruits on the job, reducing the reliance on informal systems of mentorship that were often tied to the consumption of alcohol. By formalizing the training process, the Soviets hoped to create a more professional and productive workforce, free from the distractions of workplace drinking. Yet, despite these reforms, the tradition of privolnaya persisted for decades. It became less about repaying a debt and more about maintaining a long-standing tradition that was hard to shake, despite the government's best efforts. The exact same issue of alcohol consumption and dependence extended into the military, where vodka became a staple not just for celebrations, but as a tool to keep soldiers in check. You might be surprised to learn that there was once a regular vodka ration system in place for both sailors and soldiers, a practice that lasted for many decades. Many in the military considered vodka to be essential, not only for lifting spirits during long and grueling deployments, but also as a means of maintaining morale in the harshest conditions. Whether stationed at the front lines, on naval ships, or in remote military outposts, soldiers were often issued vodka as part of their daily rations. From the early days of Imperial Russia through the Soviet era, commanders believed that alcohol could help manage the stress and fear that came with military life. In World War II, for example, Soviet soldiers were given a daily ration of 100 grams of vodka, referred to as commissar's rations, especially in times of intense fighting. This was believed to boost morale and dull the soldiers' fear before heading into battle. However, as you can imagine, the regular consumption of vodka had serious consequences on the troops' behavior and discipline. Vodka not only impaired soldiers' behavior, but it also encouraged a culture of heavy drinking within the ranks. The more soldiers drank, the more likely they were to engage in disorderly conduct. Drunkenness became a widespread issue, leading to a significant rise in misconduct, including insubordination, theft, and violence. And the problems escalated even further when rations were reduced. When the military authorities attempted to cut down on the amount of vodka distributed, it didn't solve the problem, it made it worse. Soldiers began smuggling vodka into the barracks, finding creative ways to hide their alcohol from commanding officers. This only made matters worse. Instead of moderating their consumption, soldiers resorted to secret drinking, often consuming even more than they had before. The result was an increase in drunkenness, disorder, and a spike in criminal behavior among the troops. Barracks that were already difficult to manage became nearly ungovernable, with fights, accidents, and even desertions on the rise. This created a vicious cycle, especially for new recruits. Upon joining the military, young soldiers were quickly introduced to the drinking culture by their more experienced comrades. Like I've said many times before, it wasn't just expected that they would drink, it was practically mandatory. Refusing to drink with your fellow soldiers wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as an insult. In the tightly knit bonds of military brotherhood, sharing vodka was a way of camaraderie, to prove that you were one of the group. For a new recruit, there was little room to resist the pressure. The expectation to drink with fellow soldiers was so deeply ingrained that failure to do so could lead to social isolation, ridicule, or worse. Many young soldiers had no real choice. They were introduced to alcohol from the moment they arrived, often at their first welcoming ceremony, and it became part of their daily routine. Over time, this led to a troubling cycle. New recruits, eager to fit in and be accepted, would adopt the same drinking habits as their more seasoned comrades. And as they continued down this path, many found themselves becoming alcoholics, trapped in a destructive cycle of dependence that followed them throughout their military careers and often beyond. In 1878, a commanding officer named Butovsky began a detailed investigation into the behavior of new recruits during their first 5 years in military service. His goal was to track the evolution of alcohol consumption among the recruits, from the moment they entered the service until the end of their first enlistment. What he uncovered was alarming evidence and statistics that highlighted the growing issue of alcoholism within the Russian military. According to Butovsky's findings, when recruits first joined the military, 43% of them refused their vodka ration. A surprising statistic that indicated not all recruits were immediately drawn to alcohol. At the same time, about 10% of recruits drank more than their allocated ration, showing early signs of excessive drinking. But over the course of just 1 year, these numbers changed dramatically. A year into their service, only 17% of the recruits were still refusing their vodka rations, while 27% had not only started drinking the rations, but were also consuming extra vodka on the side. Fast forward to 1883, and the situation had worsened considerably. Butovsky's study showed that by this point, only 7% of recruits were abstaining from their vodka ration. Shockingly, more than half of the soldiers were now drinking beyond the rations, consuming additional vodka in secret. Butovsky also noted that the 7% of soldiers who resisted drinking were subjected to heavy bullying and derogatory name-calling by their comrades. Non-drinkers were mockingly referred to as old women or dawdler, highlighting the toxic environment that pressured recruits into joining the drinking culture. By the 1890s, the consequences of this drinking culture became impossible to ignore. Reports of alcohol-related incidents like fights, accidents, and disciplinary issues became more common and even started drawing public attention to the problem. The devastating effects of alcoholism on soldiers' health and behavior were becoming more visible, and the broader public began to demand action. However, despite growing awareness, there was significant resistance within the military to any attempts at reform. Many officers and military leaders believed that vodka played a crucial role in keeping soldiers happy, particularly in times of long deployments and grueling conditions. Some even argued that alcohol had medicinal benefits, especially in harsh climates or during cold weather, where a shot of vodka was believed to warm the body. Still, the public remained unconvinced, so in response, the Russian Society for the Protection of Public Health stepped in and formed a commission to investigate the growing problem. Influential psychiatrists such as M.N. Nishigorodtsev took a firm stance on the matter. Nishigorodtsev advocated for the complete elimination of alcohol from military camps and barracks, proposing instead that soldiers be given a daily tea allowance as a healthier alternative. His solution was to introduce recreational activities for the lower-ranking soldiers, such as sports, games, and social events that could distract them from alcohol. But I guess Nishigorodtsev underestimated that to most Russians, vodka was like tea. So another doctor, P.V. Pudilov, took a more analytical approach to understanding the scope of the problem. He examined injuries and deaths that were likely linked to alcohol consumption, but often went unreported as such. After reviewing cases between 1890 and 1896, Pudilov concluded that alcohol poisoning was the underlying cause of 75% of all ailments suffered by soldiers admitted to medical facilities during that period. Furthermore, Pudilov estimated that between 10 and 44% of all military deaths during that time could be directly linked to alcohol abuse. If Pudilov's figures were accurate, and there's little reason to doubt them, it would suggest that alcohol was playing an absolutely devastating role in the military. Instead of addressing the problem head-on, military officials largely ignored Pudilov's findings. Rather than see alcohol as a poison eroding the health and discipline of their soldiers, they clung to the outdated belief that alcohol gave soldiers spirit, helping them face the hardships of war. This refusal to take the issue seriously would come back to haunt the Russian military in the most humiliating way during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 and 1905. The Russo-Japanese War, which was supposed to be a demonstration of Russian military might, quickly turned into a disaster, and alcohol was one of the major reasons for the army's failure. The Russian military command sent immense quantities of alcohol to the front lines, believing it would boost morale and keep soldiers steady under pressure. According to one report, the official plan for August 1904 included 300 poods of vodka for an army of 400,000 soldiers to last for 8 months, with an additional 255,000 poods allocated for the following year. To put that into perspective, 1 pood is equal to 16 kilograms, meaning the army received 4.8 million kilograms of vodka. That's an astonishing 12 kilograms of vodka for each of the 400,000 soldiers. It doesn't take much imagination to understand how disastrous this was. With such quantities of vodka readily available, many soldiers became too drunk to fight effectively. In one particularly harrowing incident, Japanese forces reportedly found several thousand Russian soldiers so dead drunk they were able to bayonet them like livestock without encountering any resistance. These scenes of soldiers incapacitated by alcohol became a symbol of the war's failure and the tragic impact of unchecked alcoholism within the ranks. It was after this catastrophic defeat that the military was finally forced to confront the reality of its alcohol problem. The leadership decided to replace vodka rations with lighter beverages, such as beer or wine, in an effort to curb the debilitating effects of heavy drinking on the troops. But this was more of a temporary measure than a long-term solution. By the time the Russian Revolution of 1917 swept across the nation, the country was on the brink of radical change, and so was the role of vodka. When the Bolsheviks seized power and established the Soviet Union, they initially sought to eliminate alcohol from public life, seeing it as a symbol of the oppression of the Tsarist era. For a brief period, vodka was all but eradicated from public life. The Bolsheviks enforced harsh penalties for alcohol production and distribution, hoping to build a new Soviet citizen free from the vices of the old world. But despite these efforts, the ban was far from successful. The demand for alcohol remained high, and black market distilleries began popping up across the country, producing illegal vodka that was often of poor quality and sometimes dangerous to drink. The state couldn't keep up with the sheer scale of illicit alcohol production, and by the 1920s, it became clear that prohibition wasn't working. Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, saw an opportunity. Instead of continuing the fight against alcohol, Stalin's government reintroduced vodka as a state-controlled commodity. In 1924, the Soviet government reintroduced vodka as a legal, state-controlled commodity, and by the 1930s, Stalin's government had fully nationalized the production and sale of alcohol. This marked the beginning of one of the most profitable state monopolies in Soviet history. The Soviet Union took control of all alcohol production, reopening old distilleries and constructing new ones to meet the growing demand. Between 1925 and 1930, dozens of new distilleries were built across the country to ramp up production. By 1934, more than 400 state-owned distilleries were in operation, with many producing vodka on an industrial scale. The Soviet government didn't just control production. It also set fixed prices and maintained strict distribution channels to ensure that vodka sales were monopolized by the state. This control allowed the government to set the price of vodka artificially high, maximizing profits. By 1935, vodka sales were generating massive revenue for the Soviet state. The figures were staggering. Vodka alone accounted for nearly 12% of the Soviet Union's total state revenue. The tax on vodka was a key component of this revenue stream. From the late 1920s through the mid-1930s, alcohol taxes were raised multiple times, ensuring that the state captured an ever-growing share of the profits from alcohol sales. By 1937, the revenue from alcohol taxes accounted for approximately 20 to 25% of the entire state budget, an astonishing figure that illustrates just how central vodka had become to the Soviet economy. In terms of raw numbers, the Soviet Union's alcohol revenues skyrocketed. In 1927, the state collected roughly 500 million rubles from alcohol taxes. By 1930, that figure had doubled to around 1 billion rubles, and by the late 1930s, alcohol revenue had reached approximately 6 to 8 billion rubles annually. This massive influx of money was used to fund Stalin's ambitious 5-year plans, which focused on rapid industrialization and military expansion, as we stated earlier. Vodka production didn't even stop during World War II. In fact, vodka was referred to as liquid currency, as the revenue was used to purchase weapons, build tanks, and sustain military logistics. To give you an even clearer picture, by the late 1930s, vodka consumption in the Soviet Union had reached an estimated 3.5 liters of pure alcohol per capita annually. By World War II, this figure had increased to 5 liters per capita. In addition to the taxes collected from vodka sales, the state also introduced excise taxes on other forms of alcohol, further boosting its revenue. By some estimates, alcohol taxes accounted for up to 30% of the Soviet Union's total tax revenue during the 1930s and early 1940s. But all of this came at a massive cost. While the Soviet economy benefited enormously from alcohol revenue, the social consequences were severe. It was estimated that up to 25 to 30% of all deaths in the Soviet Union were attributable to alcohol consumption. The liver was the first organ to suffer. Chronic alcohol abuse leads to conditions such as fatty liver, alcoholic hepatitis, and ultimately cirrhosis, a condition in which the liver becomes scarred and loses its ability to function properly. Cirrhosis is a slow, painful killer, and by the 1950s, cirrhosis of the liver had become one of the leading causes of death among Soviet men. Soviet health statistics from the late 1950s indicated that alcohol-related liver disease was responsible for nearly 10% of male deaths. Excessive vodka consumption also led to cardiovascular issues. Chronic heavy drinking increases blood pressure, weakens the heart muscle, and contributes to the development of arrhythmias and heart attacks. By the 1960s, cardiovascular diseases caused by heavy drinking became a major health crisis in the Soviet Union. Soviet medical reports from the mid-1960s showed that nearly 15% of all cardiovascular deaths were directly linked to excessive alcohol consumption. Over the next 5 to 10 years, the life expectancy of Soviet men began to drop, falling from 65 years to 63 years. This decline was not only due to alcohol-related deaths, including liver disease and alcohol poisoning, but also from increased accidents and violent crimes committed by drunk Soviets. Soviet mortality rates also skyrocketed during this period. By the late 1970s, Soviet men started dying at an alarming rate. The average male life expectancy dropped to 61. This was significantly lower than in other industrialized nations. In some regions, particularly in Siberia and the Russian Far East, male life expectancy was as low as 55 years. Women, on the other hand, had a much higher life expectancy, averaging around 72 years. But this difference created a sharp demographic imbalance, with far more women than men surviving into old age. On one hand, alcoholism was not only killing off Soviet men at a young age, but it was also contributing to a declining birth rate. Many men of childbearing age were either too sick or too incapacitated by alcohol to start families. The physical and mental toll of long-term alcoholism also led to infertility and impotence in many men. Chronic alcohol abuse was found to impair sperm production, leading to lower sperm quality and quantity, which significantly contributed to male infertility during that era. A study found that around 50% of infertility cases were linked to male factors. In severe cases, alcohol led to hormonal imbalances and damage to the reproductive system, further increasing infertility rates. Over the next decade, alcohol-related deaths more than doubled, with tens of thousands of men dying each year from alcohol poisoning alone. Soviet hospitals were overwhelmed with cases of alcohol-induced liver disease, heart attacks, and alcohol poisoning. By 1980, alcohol was responsible for nearly 20% of all male deaths in the Soviet Union. Cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease, and alcohol poisoning were the three leading alcohol-related causes of death. The Soviet leadership, while aware of the problem, found themselves in a difficult position. The state heavily relied on vodka sales for revenue. By 1975, alcohol taxes made up between 15% and 20% of the Soviet budget. Cutting back on vodka production would mean losing billions in revenue. But at the same time, the cost of alcohol-related social and health problems was growing exponentially. So, in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an ambitious anti-alcohol campaign in an attempt to reverse decades of alcohol abuse and its damaging effects on society. The campaign, known as the Dry Law, sought to drastically reduce alcohol consumption by limiting the production and sale of vodka and other spirits. Gorbachev ordered the destruction of vineyards, distilleries, and vodka production facilities. Alcohol sales were restricted to certain hours of the day, and the price of vodka was increased significantly to make it less affordable. Initially, the campaign appeared to be successful. Alcohol consumption dropped by nearly 50% between 1985 and 1987, and alcohol-related deaths fell sharply. Male life expectancy rose for the first time in decades, reaching 65 years by 1987. However, the campaign also had significant unintended consequences. The sharp reduction in legal alcohol production led to a booming black market for homemade vodka, or samogon. Soviet citizens began distilling their own alcohol at home, leading to a surge in alcohol poisoning cases as poorly made samogon often contained dangerous levels of methanol and other toxic substances. The financial impact of Gorbachev's anti-alcohol campaign was also severe. With legal vodka sales plummeting, the Soviet government lost a significant source of revenue. By 1988, the state budget was facing a shortfall of billions of rubles due to the collapse in alcohol tax revenue. This loss of income further exacerbated the economic crisis that was already brewing in the Soviet Union, contributing to the weakening of the Soviet economy in the years leading up to its collapse. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia faced an unprecedented economic crisis. The sudden transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based system led to rampant inflation, widespread poverty, and the collapse of many state industries. The healthcare system, which had once been publicly funded, began to disintegrate, and access to basic medical care became severely limited. As a result, Russia experienced a sharp decline in living standards, and the health of its population deteriorated. Now let's take a look at the state the Soviet Union left its population in. By 1991, Russia's birth rate was already on the decline, largely due to decades of alcohol abuse, poor health care, and economic struggles. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, things got even worse. By 1999, Russia's birth rate had hit a record low, just 8.3 births per 1,000 people, down from around 13 per 1,000 in 1990. In 1991, the average life expectancy for Russian men was about 64 years. However, by 1994, it had plummeted to just 57 years. Women, on the other hand, fared a little better, but their life expectancy also fell from 74 years in 1991 to around 71 by 1994. The post-Soviet years clearly took a heavy toll on the population. Then Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, but his tenure was marked by political instability, economic hardship, and widespread corruption. Yeltsin's government implemented a series of economic reforms known as shock therapy, which involved the rapid privatization of state assets and the liberalization of prices. While these reforms were intended to jumpstart the Russian economy, they instead led to hyperinflation, mass unemployment, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small group of oligarchs. Deaths from alcohol didn't change and still remained around 30%. Then, in 1999, Vladimir Putin came to power following Yeltsin's resignation, and his presidency marked a period of relative political stability and economic recovery. Under Putin's leadership, the Russian government took significant steps to reduce alcohol consumption. New regulations were introduced to restrict the sale of alcohol, including banning the sale of vodka during certain hours and raising the minimum price of alcohol to make it less affordable. The government also cracked down on the production and sale of illegal vodka, which had become a major problem during the 1990s. In addition, public health campaigns were launched to raise awareness about the dangers of excessive drinking. According to the World Health Organization, these efforts had a noticeable impact. Between 2003 and 2018, alcohol consumption in Russia fell by 43%. By 2015, the average Russian adult was consuming around 10 liters of pure alcohol per year, down from the peak of 18 liters in the mid-1990s. As a result, life expectancy began to rise. By 2019, the average life expectancy for men had increased to 68 years, and for women it had reached 78 years. In addition to addressing alcohol consumption, the Putin government also introduced policies aimed at reversing the country's demographic decline. One of the most notable of these policies was the introduction of the Maternity Capital Program in 2007, which provided financial incentives for families to have more children. This policy, along with economic stabilization, led to a modest increase in the birth rate during the late 2000s and early 2010s. By 2013, the birth rate had risen to 13.3 births per 1,000 people, up from the low of 8.3 per 1,000 in 1999. However, these gains were short-lived. By the mid-2010s, the birth rate began to decline again, and by 2020, it had fallen to 10.1 births per 1,000 people. This demographic decline has been exacerbated by Russia's aging population and a shrinking workforce, both of which are legacies of the demographic crises of the 1990s and early 2000s. Then Putin just made everything worse by invading Ukraine in February 2022. The wars triggered a massive exodus of educated, skilled, and wealthy Russians, leading to what's commonly referred to as a brain drain. Many young professionals, including doctors, engineers, and IT specialists, have fled the country due to fears of conscription, economic sanctions, and the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin regime. It's estimated that between 500,000 and 1 million Russians have left the country since the start of the war, many of whom were highly educated and part of the professional class. This brain drain will have long-term consequences for Russia's economy and its ability to compete on the global stage. The loss of highly skilled workers will make it difficult for Russia to innovate, particularly in industries such as technology, medicine, and engineering. As the country loses its best and brightest, it'll face increasing challenges in maintaining its economic and military strength, especially as Western sanctions continue to bite. The war in Ukraine has also had a direct impact on Russia's demographics. In 2022, it was reported that many of the soldiers sent to fight in Ukraine were from poorer, rural regions of Russia where the demographic situation was already fragile. These regions, particularly in the Caucasus and Siberia, have been hit hard by the war, as young men are either killed in combat or return home with severe injuries, reducing their ability to contribute to the economy or start families. But from Putin's perspective, this war makes sense in terms of demographics. You see, the timing of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was particularly crucial for Russia. By that year, many of Russia's young men were reaching the age of military service, creating a fleeting window for the government to draw from a relatively stable pool of fighting-age men. This demographic window was critical because Russia's population pyramid, essentially the age structure of the population, has been steadily shifting, with fewer young people coming of age each year due to the long-term demographic decline Russia's been experiencing since the 1990s. Russia's population pyramid, when viewed in detail, shows an increasingly top-heavy structure, which means there are more elderly citizens and fewer young people. In the 1990s, Russia's birth rate plummeted and the country faced a steep population decline. As a result, fewer children were born during that period, creating a gap in the younger age cohorts that's now starting to show its impact. The children born during the early post-Soviet years, those in the 1990s, are now the young adults of today, and their numbers are far smaller compared to previous generations. For a healthy, growing population, the base of the pyramid is wide, representing a large number of children and young adults, and it narrows as it moves upward, indicating fewer elderly people. In Russia's case, however, the pyramid has a constricted base and a bulging middle, reflecting a high proportion of middle-aged and elderly individuals and a shrinking pool of younger people. This generation, now in their mid-20s to early 30s, provided the bulk of Russia's fighting force for the Ukraine invasion. However, had Putin delayed the invasion for several more years, the demographic situation would have worsened to the point where Russia might not have had enough fighting-age men to sustain a large-scale military operation. This demographic shift is often described as a demographic cliff because it represents a sharp decline in the number of young people available to serve in the military. By 2025 or 2030, the majority of the young men who formed the backbone of Russia's fighting force in 2022 would have aged out of the military service range, moving into their 30s and 40s. At the same time, the next generation of recruits, those born after the mid-1990s, would be smaller in number, providing a far less robust pool of conscripts or professional soldiers. But this war will also have a massive impact on Russia's demographics. Thousands of Russian soldiers have already been killed in the conflict, and many more have been wounded. Every young man lost in the war represents a future father, a worker, and a member of the community, further shrinking the already limited pool of potential recruits and economic contributors. As it stands, the war's accelerating Russia's demographic decline, and the loss of life on the battlefield, combined with the brain drain of young professionals, will have long-lasting consequences for the country's military and economic future. Over the next decade, Russia's aging population and shrinking youth cohort will present significant challenges, further weakening its position on the global stage.